Hello everyone, and welcome to Stories for Sleep. I'm here to guide you through another night, helping you drift into calmness with a story that'll stay with you long after the lights go out. Before we dive in, take a second, hit like, subscribe, and let me know where in the world you're listening from. What time is it for you? Midnight? Early morning? Either way, this moment is yours. So, get comfortable, let the tension melt away, and prepare to lose yourself in a story that'll leave you wondering long after the last word. Ready? Let's begin. It was the kind of apartment that seemed perfect on paper. It was affordable, tucked away on a quiet street where the sound of traffic felt miles away, and it came with windows that let in just the right amount of morning light. The landlord had seemed nice enough, a little too eager to get the lease signed, but it didn't raise any suspicions. It was the kind of place you'd look at once, shake your head at the odd layout, and then move in, ready to start the next chapter of your life. But as the weeks went on, the apartment, or maybe the walls themselves, started to feel different. There was something off about the place. The air was stale, the kind of stale that clung to your clothes, like the smell of an old book that's been left closed for too long. At first, they thought it was just a coincidence, a passing thing, like the odd creak of a floorboard or the faint rustle of the blinds. But eventually, they couldn't ignore it anymore. The writing started small, just a faint smudge on the white wall by the kitchen counter, like a smear of grease or dust. No big deal. They wiped it away without much thought, chalking it up to something harmless, a trick of the light, or perhaps a smudge from the landlord's last cleaning. But the next day, the writing came back. This time, it was clearer, sharper. It was a word, one they didn't recognize at first. Linger. Just that one word, etched into the wall. At first, they thought it was some kind of graffiti left by a previous tenant. Maybe a joke or something meant to be clever. But there was no mistaking the way it appeared. It wasn't as though someone had written it with a pen or spray paint. It was almost as if the word had formed there, etched by some unseen hand, as though it had always been a part of the wall, hiding there, waiting for someone to notice. Maybe it's just the humidity, they told themselves, trying to brush it off. They'd seen weird things happen in old buildings before. Cracks in the foundation that looked like words, shadows that crept across the ceiling, things that could be explained away if you just tried hard enough. The next day, they gave the wall a quick wipe with a rag and some cleaner, but the word refused to fade. Linger. This time, the letters were deeper, darker, as though the wall itself had soaked in the ink, and the word lingered, a part of it. They rubbed at it harder, the cloth in their hand leaving a faint outline of the word, as if it had somehow seeped beneath the paint. The following night, as they sat on the couch, absent-mindedly flipping through old magazines and scrolling through their phone, they thought they saw something else. In the corner of their eye, out of the corner of the room, the word had changed. It had grown. The linger was still there, but now, beneath it, was another word, tomorrow. The letters were faint, barely visible unless you squinted, but they were there, slinking into existence beneath the first word. They hadn't been there the night before. Of that, they were certain. They hadn't even noticed the first word until after they'd wiped it clean. This was different. This was wrong. Linger tomorrow. It wasn't just the fact that the words were appearing. It was the feeling they brought with them, that sense of something growing, something creeping up from the base of the apartment, from the very walls themselves. The creeping sense of a presence watching, writing, recording. When the words appeared the next morning, the pattern grew. More phrases, more passages. They started coming faster now, as though the walls had begun to speak, had begun to want to speak. This time, there was no wiping it away. No scrubbing with soap or water could remove them. The words didn't care about the wet rags or the force of a scrubbing brush. They didn't care about the attempts to push them back into the cracks. The words were the cracks. You can't escape. This time, the words sprawled across the living room wall, as though they had taken on a life of their own. The message was clearer than ever. The ink now seemed to bleed across the plaster like something organic. The letters stretched, sagged like melted wax, dripping down toward the baseboards. It felt wrong, like they were being watched, but not by any living thing. The air in the apartment felt colder now. The kind of cold that comes from the inside. The kind that makes your breath catch in your chest when you open your mouth to speak. You can't escape. The words echoed in their mind long after the lights were turned off for the night. They stared at the wall from the bed, the glow of the street lights creeping in through the curtains, casting eerie shadows across the room. The words swam in their vision, dancing on the walls like ghosts. You can't escape. And the more they tried to push them out of their head, the more the words stuck. It was like a broken record playing over and over, the loop tightening with each passing second. It was almost as if the apartment was trying to tell them something they didn't want to hear. They had tried to ignore it, tried to convince themselves that it was just their imagination, some trick of light, or the odd quirks of old construction. But there was no denying it, no denying the way the words seemed to form themselves, no denying the way the apartment seemed to whisper at night, as if it was telling them a story they hadn't yet heard. The more they looked at the walls, the more it felt like the apartment was alive, watching, waiting, writing. The next morning, when they stumbled into the kitchen to brew coffee, they stopped dead in their tracks. It was everywhere. The walls, the counters, the cabinets. The words were everywhere. You can't escape. You shouldn't try. Don't fight it. You're already here. The phrases repeated themselves in an unholy, looping dance, no longer just confined to the wall by the sink, but sprawled out across the entire apartment. The words seemed to bleed together, weaving in and out of each other, like the tendrils of some dark vine. And now there were more of them. The apartment wasn't just writing, it was telling them something that made their skin prickle and their breath catch in their throat, something that made them afraid to touch the walls. You're already here. The words felt more like a sentence now, not just a warning. They seemed to echo the sound of the apartment itself, as though the walls were speaking, not to them, but through them. The sensation was terrifying, primal. The idea that the apartment had some kind of control over their movements, their thoughts, their very presence in the place. What did it mean? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning? They tried to erase the words again with every cleaning supply they had on hand. They scrubbed, they wiped, they even tried to paint over them, but nothing worked. No matter what they did, the writing returned, more persistent than before. as though the apartment itself was drawing them in. And then, at the very bottom of the latest passage, they saw a new phrase. It was simple. You are not the first. And that's when it all began to make sense. They weren't the first. This apartment, this place, had been here for far longer than they had. The walls had always written. The walls had always been waiting. And they had been waiting for them. They weren't just a tenant. They were part of the story. They weren't just a tenant. They were part of the story. The words, cold and chilling, echoed through their mind like a constant hum, a buzzing in the back of their skull that never seemed to quiet. You are not the first. Those words had been the moment when everything shifted, when the illusion of the apartment as a quiet, nondescript space had cracked open like an old, decaying book, revealing a darkness within it, a malignancy that had been waiting for someone, waiting for them. The apartment seemed to settle into a suffocating silence in the aftermath of that realization, as if it were watching, waiting for them to do something. But there was nothing to be done. The walls, thick with the weight of the writing, were its own kind of prison, an invisible chain that shackled them in place. The more they fought against it, the more it pulled them in. That night, they couldn't sleep. The bed felt like a coffin, the weight of the silence pressing down on them, heavier with each passing minute. The darkness of the room stretched out like an endless void, swallowing the edges of their vision. And the walls were still whispering. They couldn't hear the words, but they could feel them, crawling over their skin, slipping into their thoughts like cold fingers, scratching at the back of their mind. The clock on the nightstand ticked. Tick, tick, tick. But each passing second felt like an eternity. They kept their eyes closed, not daring to look at the walls, afraid of what they might see, afraid of the inevitability of it all. But sleep never came. The weight of the apartment's history pressed too hard against them. And then the dream began. At first, it wasn't a dream. It was more like a memory, familiar and foreign all at once. They were standing in the apartment, only it wasn't their apartment. The walls were different, darker, more stained. The air was heavy with a sense of neglect, but in the dream, it felt like they belonged there, like they had always belonged there. The hallway stretched on for miles, the floors creaking underfoot. A door at the end of the hall beckoned them forward. They couldn't see what was beyond it, but they knew they had to open it. They had to. There was something waiting for them inside, something that had been waiting a long time. As they walked toward the door, the walls seemed to shift. The faded wallpaper buckled and peeled, revealing what looked like scrawled phrases underneath. Words they couldn't make out, but they felt the pulse of them, like they were alive, shifting just beyond comprehension. The floorboards groaned, and with each step, the air grew colder. When they reached the door, the handle turned easily, as though it had been waiting for them. Inside the room was dim, lit only by the faintest glow coming from the far corner. But the shadows there moved, and the flickering light cast shapes that shouldn't have been, shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. They weren't quite human, but they were almost human. One shape stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it was choosing its steps carefully, measuring each one. And then it spoke, its voice nothing more than a low rasp, like nails scraping across the surface of a chalkboard. You were meant to be here. The words hit them like a physical blow. They couldn't breathe, couldn't think. A wave of cold dread swept over them, and for a moment they couldn't move. The shadow, the shape, reached out a hand. Not quite a hand, but more like a suggestion of one. Long fingers that stretched impossibly. As it drew nearer, it opened its mouth, its jaw unhinging, the darkness spilling from its throat. And then, just as the darkness was about to swallow them whole, they woke. But the feeling didn't go away. The sense that the apartment, the walls, were still there, watching, waiting. It was almost worse now. The silence of the room more oppressive than ever. The walls seemed to hum with energy, as if they were alive, as if they had been waiting for them to wake. They couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. They had to leave. They had to get out. The next day, they packed what little belongings they had, shoving clothes into a suitcase with shaking hands. But as they turned to leave, something caught their eye. Something on the wall. The writing. The words. They had started to form again. You can't leave. You're already here. You are the story. The words had changed. They weren't the same as the ones from before. The walls had shifted. The language more threatening now. More urgent. As if the apartment itself were begging them to stay, to continue reading its pages. They walked out, not looking back, their heart pounding in their chest like a drumbeat. But it was impossible to escape. It felt like the apartment followed them, like its influence seeped into the world outside, bleeding into every corner of their mind. Every step they took, every breath they drew, felt like part of the apartment's design. They were trapped, even now. The next few days were a blur of frantic attempts to push the apartment out of their mind, to ignore the growing sense of dread that followed them everywhere they went. They tried to fill their time, staying out of their apartment as much as possible, but the fear never went away. It clung to them like a shadow, suffocating them, whispering at the edges of their thoughts. They tried to rationalize it. Maybe it's just stress. Maybe it's the pressure of living in such a strange place. Maybe it's just exhaustion from trying to adjust to something new. But nothing worked. The words, the writing, were still there, lingering at the edges of their mind. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw the walls, felt the cold fingers of the apartment creeping into their thoughts, pushing their way into their every waking moment. Then, one morning, they found something new. They had returned to the apartment against their better judgment, looking for something they had left behind. But the moment they stepped through the door, they felt it. The oppressive weight, the sickly presence that hung in the air. And as they turned to look at the wall by the door, they saw it. The words had returned, filling the wall entirely, stretching from one corner of the room to the other. You cannot escape. We have written your fate. This is the end. A chill ran down their spine as they read the words, their heart hammering in their chest. It was too much. There was no escaping it. The apartment had already begun writing, had already decided what they were, who they were meant to be. They weren't just a tenant. They were a character. And this story had no end. The walls were still watching, still waiting, and no matter how hard they tried to fight it, no matter how far they ran, they couldn't escape. The apartment had become a prison, a suffocating cage that they couldn't see but could feel. pressing in from all sides. The words on the walls, "You cannot escape. We have written your fate. This is the end," had been burned into their brain. A constant refrain, an unholy mantra they couldn't stop hearing. No matter how many times they tried to leave, no matter how far they ran, the apartment seemed to follow, its cold fingers curling around their thoughts, pulling them back. They had tried to call the landlord, tried to ask if anyone else had experienced anything strange. But each time they picked up the phone, the number dialed would ring once, twice, then a recorded message would play, something about the voicemail being full. There was no answer. It was as if the world outside had simply stopped existing, leaving only the apartment, leaving only the walls, leaving only the words. The apartment had always been there. That was the thought that gnawed at them now, like a piece of glass lodged in their throat. It had always been waiting, and they were never meant to leave. It had written their story, and there was no escaping it. They had become obsessed. The apartment's hold on them was growing stronger, like a magnet pulling them in against their will. They had tried to ignore it, tried to live their life as normally as they could. But the walls never let go. They could feel it now, even when they weren't looking. They could sense the weight of the words, the growing presence of the apartment's watchful eyes. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind outside felt like it was a part of the apartment's slow, suffocating embrace. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon and the apartment was swallowed in darkness, they sat in the living room, staring at the wall across from them. The words were there again. They had always been there, but tonight they felt different. The letters were sharper, more defined, like they were pressing through the wall itself, as though the apartment were trying to claw its way into their mind. "We are always here. You will never leave. You will never be free." The letters seemed to pulse, the darkness around them thickening like tar. They could hear the faint scratching sound now, too, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was like something was trying to break through the wall, something alive, something that had always been there, hidden in the cracks, waiting for the right moment. In the corner of their eye, the shadows began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a flicker, a movement. But then, as the seconds dragged on, the shadows grew more defined, more deliberate, and with it came the sound, scratching, like nails dragging across stone, like something was trying to claw its way out. They couldn't look away, couldn't stop looking. The shadows stretched, writhed, and then, there, in the middle of the room, emerged a figure. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was a thing that stood just beyond the edges of their understanding, something too twisted to make sense of, but all too real. The figure was draped in a black cloak, its features obscured by the darkness, but its presence, it felt like it had always been there, like it was made of the apartment's own shadows, the kind that waited in the corners, watching. For a moment, they thought they were imagining it, but then the figure moved closer, and they felt their heart stop. It wasn't walking, not in any conventional way. It floated, its feet never quite touching the ground. The dark cloak fluttered around it, its edges swirling like smoke, and as it drew closer, they could feel the pull of it, like gravity itself had shifted. It was drawing them in. The temperature in the room dropped, the air thickening with a presence, a suffocating, overwhelming feeling that made it hard to breathe. The figure's head turned toward them. The eyes, those eyes, were the only thing visible beneath the hood, and they were watching, staring, with eyes that were too wide, too empty, as if they had been hollowed out. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. "You have seen us before, but you didn't know it. You have always been a part of the story. Always." The words slithered into their mind, filling the space between their thoughts like an invading force, pushing everything else out. They tried to speak, to scream, but the words caught in their throat, stuck, like there was something in their mouth that wouldn't let them speak. The figure's smile, if you could call it a smile, was wide, too wide, and when it spoke again, its voice was like ice, cold and brittle, cracking with a hunger that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "It's too late now. You are ours. You belong to the story." A scream clawed its way out of them, but it was weak, muffled, like the apartment itself had swallowed it before it could escape. The figure stepped forward, and with each step, the room grew colder. The walls seemed to close in, the space shrinking, suffocating. The writing on the walls began to shift again, the letters warping and twisting as if they were alive, writhing with a dark energy, feeding off the fear in the room. The figure reached out a hand, and for a moment, the air seemed to crackle with electricity. They could feel the weight of it in the room, the power, the dark force that had been waiting all along. The hand extended, and just as it was about to touch them, they woke. The apartment was still, silent. The shadows were just shadows again. No figure, no presence looming in the corner, but the fear lingered, thick in the air, hanging like a cloud. They shot up from the bed, breathing heavily, sweat clinging to their skin. The room was as it had always been, but something was different. The walls had changed again. The words were no longer passive, no longer merely sentences or phrases. They were directions. "Look at the wall. Go to the kitchen. Open the drawer. Take the knife." The voice, the figure, wasn't gone. It was still there, in the air, in the walls, seeping through the cracks like smoke. The apartment was giving them orders now, telling them what to do, how to move. They were no longer a passive participant in the story. They were a character, a marionette. The writing had begun to shape their movements, shaping the very actions of their life. And no matter how hard they fought, no matter how they tried to ignore it, the story, the apartment, would always find a way to pull them back. They looked at the wall. It was waiting, and the apartment was never done with them. It had only just begun. They had tried to resist, but the apartment had never allowed them to. The voice in the walls, the figure in the shadows, was no longer just a vague memory. It had grown, become real, its presence undeniable, its power suffocating. The words on the walls, scrawled in that insistent, relentless hand, dictated everything. And now it was as if the apartment had taken on a life of its own, its walls throbbing with energy, with purpose, as though it were a living organism, feeding off their every movement, their every choice. Look at the wall. Go to the kitchen. Open the drawer. Take the knife. The words didn't feel like a suggestion. They felt like an order. And when they hesitated, even for a moment, the sensation of the apartment pressing in on them grew stronger, more forceful, like the walls themselves were squeezing the air from their lungs. The apartment had written their story already, and there was no escaping it. They stood frozen in place, staring at the wall, the words glaring back at them, mocking them. The pressure in their chest was unbearable, like they couldn't breathe without the apartment's permission. It was as if the walls had taken on a pulse, a rhythm. Their heart matched the beat, hammering in time with the writing. Every part of them screamed to turn away, to flee, but there was nowhere to run. The apartment had already consumed them, and they could feel it now, a weight pressing down on their shoulders. The idea that they were being watched, controlled, manipulated, had never felt more real. They could almost hear the walls whispering, feel their presence behind the thin layer of plaster. The voice had become more insistent, more alive, and it wasn't content with just telling them what to do. Now it was guiding them, telling them where to go, what to feel, what to think. With trembling hands, they walked toward the kitchen. The floorboards creaked underfoot as they moved, the sound strangely loud in the suffocating silence of the apartment. The air was heavy, thick with the oppressive presence that lingered in the walls. And as they stepped into the kitchen, they felt it again, the pull. The walls seemed to stretch toward them, hungry, urging them forward. The drawer. The words had said to open the drawer. It didn't matter that they didn't want to. It didn't matter that every part of their body screamed to resist. The apartment was pulling them in, like a magnet drawing them closer. The drawer slid open with a sound like a sigh, a soft, hollow click, as if it had been waiting for them to open it. The knife was there, shiny, cold, and sharp. It gleamed under the dim light, its metal reflecting the faint glow of the kitchen lamp. And for a long, sickening moment, they couldn't look away. The blade seemed to call to them, its sharp edge beckoning, promising something they couldn't quite understand. The writing in the walls was clearer now, more demanding. Take it. Use it. They wanted to scream, to throw the knife across the room and run, but their hand moved of its own accord. The apartment wasn't just writing their story anymore. It was directing them. It had become the author. And they were just a character, trapped in the narrative, unable to escape. The air grew colder, so cold that their breath came in visible clouds, and they could feel the chill in their bones. It wasn't natural. This wasn't just a draft, or the old pipes groaning. This was something else, something unnatural. The apartment had grown darker, more oppressive. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more alive, as though they were watching, waiting for them to make the next move. They had never wanted this, never wanted any of it. But the apartment had taken hold of them, twisted them, made them part of its terrible, dark story. And nay, it was rewriting them. A sound scraped against their ears, like nails on a chalkboard, the scraping of words being rewritten. They looked up, and for the briefest moment, they could see the walls moving. The writing was shifting, rearranging itself, as though the words themselves had a life beyond mere ink. They could feel the apartment's hunger growing, feel the pull in their gut, the gnawing sensation that something was waiting, just beyond the walls, just beyond their understanding. The walls had become more than a reflection of their past. They were the reflection of everything, their choices, their regrets, their deepest fears. The apartment knew them. It had always known them. The walls didn't just hold their story. The walls were writing their story, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The voice in their head, The voice that was the apartment's voice spoke again, its tone different this time, darker. The words didn't feel like an order anymore. They felt like a promise. You will use the knife. You will end the story. And when you do, we will write it again. And then there was nothing. The silence that followed was almost worse than the words. The pressure on their chest, the weight of the apartment, was unbearable. They stood there, frozen, the knife still cold in their hand. And for a moment, they thought maybe they had misheard it. Maybe they had imagined it, but they hadn't. The walls knew. The walls had always known. The writing on the walls began again, but this time it was different. It wasn't words anymore. It was images. They flashed before their eyes in quick, disorienting succession. Scenes from their past, moments they had long forgotten, things they had tried to bury. Faces, places, names, all of it written on the walls, swirling, shifting like a dark tapestry of their life. And in the middle of it all, there was a single sentence, scrawled across the center in bold, jagged letters. You are the end. The air grew colder still, the apartment closing in, the walls pressing tighter against them. They could feel it now, more clearly than ever before. The apartment wasn't just writing the story. It was writing the end. And no matter what they did, no matter how hard they fought, there was nothing they could do to change it. They weren't in control anymore. The apartment had already decided their fate. The end had already been written. They turned the knife over in their hand, its cold surface slick with the sweat on their palm. There was no escape, no way out. And then, as the words on the walls began to pulse and twist, a terrible realization struck them. The story, the apartment, it had always been their story, from the very beginning. They had been trapped inside it, living out the pages without ever knowing they were nothing more than a character that had no say in the ending. The knife trembled in their grip, and the apartment waited. It was time to write the final chapter. The end was coming. It had always been coming. They knew that now. The apartment, the walls, the voice, the writing, none of it had been a mistake. The apartment had chosen them from the start, had lured them in with its false promises of a perfect place to live, a safe haven, but it was never safe. It was never meant to be. The knife felt heavy in their hand, colder now, colder than the air around them. Every breath they took tasted wrong, like the air itself was thickening with something dark. The walls were alive with the writing, and they could feel the pull, the steady tug of the apartment's grip on them. The words on the walls had become clearer, more distinct, more demanding. You are the end. There is nothing left to write. You are the last chapter. The writing hadn't stopped shifting. The sentences, the letters, had grown bolder, more insistent. They had stopped being words. They were now pictures, like a series of photographs running in fast motion, each one more disturbing than the last. Faces blurred with terror, a hand raised in desperation, a door slammed shut, trapping someone inside. And through it all, the voice, the figure, echoed in the silence, its cold whisper a constant presence in their mind. It's time. You will end it. They had been waiting for this moment, for the apartment to come full circle, for the writing to reach its inevitable conclusion. But now that they were here, they didn't know if they could go through with it. The knife was still cold in their hand, its reflection casting strange shadows on the kitchen floor. What was real? Were the walls real? Was the writing real? Or had they been part of the apartment's design from the beginning? Was the story real? Or had it all been written for them? A play, a performance, where they were the unwilling star, the only character who didn't know the lines. They glanced at the walls again, but this time, it wasn't the writing that caught their attention. It was the figure, the shadow standing just beyond the corner of their vision. The figure they had seen before. The figure that had always been there, watching, waiting. It was taller now, its cloak flowing like smoke, its presence filling the room, blocking out the light. You've always known what this was, haven't you? The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once, its chill crawling down their spine. They couldn't answer. They didn't have the words anymore. The apartment had swallowed them whole, and the more they struggled, the more the apartment seemed to feed, its walls growing tighter around them. The figure stepped closer, moving silently across the room, its presence darkening every corner. They could feel the pull of it now, stronger than ever, like gravity itself was shifting, like the world was tilting sideways. There was no escape. There had never been an escape. You are the final chapter. Your fate has been sealed. The walls seemed to close in, and the writing blurred, the letters twisting and bending into shapes that made no sense, lines that wrapped around the corners of the room, digging into the very bones of the apartment. The space was shrinking, pulling them into the center of the room, where the knife gleamed on the counter as though it were waiting. They felt the pressure in their chest again, the weight of the apartment, the suffocating silence, the knowing, crushing weight of their existence as part of the story, part of the apartment's design. They were trapped. The walls, the voice, the figure, all of it, pushing them closer to the inevitable end. The figure reached out, its hand now more solid, more real, with long, gnarled fingers that seemed to stretch impossibly. It moved like it was in no rush, as though it had all the time in the world. And then it touched them. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a command, a pull, like a thread being tugged in the dark. You've always been part of this story. You've always belonged to us. A surge of terror flooded their chest. They couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The walls were closing in around them, pressing tighter, suffocating them with their own fear. The knife in their hand felt heavier now, impossibly heavy. The air had turned to ice, and they could see their breath puffing in front of them, quick, frantic, like the last signs of life before the end. But even in that moment, in the crushing weight of their own fear, something shifted. The words on the wall, the writing, didn't stop. They changed. They weren't orders anymore. They weren't commands. They were something else. You can end this. You can break free. Write your own story. The words burned in their mind, searing into them like a fire. It was the first time the apartment hadn't been dictating their fate. It was offering them something, an out, a chance to escape. For a moment, they just stood there, holding the knife, feeling the air pulse with something new, something like hope. Could it be true? Could they actually break free? Could they defy the walls? Defy the story? The figure in the corner seemed to sense the change in them. Its cold eyes narrowed, its mouth twisting into something that almost resembled a smile. But it wasn't a smile. It was a threat. You cannot escape. You will always be ours. The walls responded. The writing responded. It all swirled together, a dark storm of words, a cacophony of voices and images, all blending, all pushing them forward, into the knife, into the choice. They raised the blade. The cold metal gleamed as they took a step toward the wall. The air was thick, unbearable, as if the apartment itself was trying to pull them back, trying to rewrite the end before it even happened. The figure stepped forward again, its hands outstretched, its voice low and thick with malice. Number, this is not your choice to make. You are ours. But they didn't listen. They couldn't. Not anymore. With every ounce of strength they had left, they plunged the knife into the wall. The impact was sharp. The apartment shuddered, a sound like bones cracking under pressure, and for the first time, the walls screamed. The writing stopped. The presence of the figure, the voice, the oppressive weight of the apartment, they all stopped. The walls collapsed inward, the writing peeling off like paper caught in a fire, disintegrating into ash. The apartment trembled as though the foundation of its very being was shaking apart, and the darkness, the suffocating, oppressive darkness, began to recede. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air felt clear, free. They stepped back, breathing in the new air, their chest rising and falling in frantic, uneven breaths. The apartment was silent now, utterly still. The writing on the walls was gone. The figure was gone. Everything was silent. And then, just as they turned to leave, the apartment gave one final, terrible shudder. The last whisper, the final words of the story, scratched at the back of their mind. You can't escape. You were never meant to. But they were already gone. There's something unsettling about a gift that carries no warmth. It's not just the item itself, but the way it sits in your mind after you've accepted it, as if it's always been meant for you, but not in a way that brings comfort. There's a coldness to it, a foreboding sense that it was never really yours to begin with. Adam felt that way the day he received the marionette. He was sorting through some old boxes in the attic, the house dim with the dull gray light of a waning afternoon. The house had been in his family for generations, handed down like an inheritance of stone and wood, but it had long ago surrendered its warmth, fallen into a state of dilapidation that no coat of paint or new carpet could cover. Adam had only just moved in, a reluctant resident in his late uncle's home, the man who had lived here alone for years and died without ever leaving the place. The marionette had been tucked into a corner of a dusty, forgotten trunk, hidden under old clothes, its face concealed by a dirty cloth. Adam had initially ignored it. He wasn't one for old trinkets or sentimental keepsakes. But then, as his hand brushed against the cloth, he felt a strange pull, as if the object itself had called out to him. He lifted the cloth, revealing a marionette, but not just any marionette. This one seemed too real. Its painted face was unnervingly lifelike, the tiny carved eyes gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. The wood was worn smooth with age, and yet the puppet's body felt solid, as though it might actually move if he weren't watching it closely enough. Its little hands, jointed at the wrists, looked as though they might reach out and grab hold of his fingers at any moment. A shiver ran down his spine as he gently lifted it from the trunk. It wasn't the puppet itself that unsettled him, though. It was the strings. Most marionettes are simple things, fragile threads, usually just a few, that hang limply from a wooden crossbar. This one, however, had an intricate network of strings, 12, maybe more, that stretched up and out from its body, curling in a web of delicate knots and loops. The marionette's arms and legs were poised as if frozen in mid-dance, as though it were waiting for someone to wind it up and bring it to life. But the strangest thing was its expression. It wasn't a doll's vacant smile or a painted frown. This puppet's face was alive, caught in the middle of something unnatural. A twisted little grin pulled at the corners of its painted lips, its eyes half-lidded in a way that was almost too human. Adam, unable to tear his eyes away from it, let out a shaky breath. The sensation was growing stronger, like an invisible hand was pressing against his chest. It was the feeling of being watched, of being pulled into something. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just an old doll. Just an old doll. But as he turned to leave the attic, a fleeting thought struck him. The strings, they were moving. No, not moving. Shifting, stretching taut and slack in rhythm with the quiet creaks of the old house. For a moment, Adam thought he might have imagined it, but then he blinked, and the strings were definitely different. Some of them pulled tighter than before, others looser, as if the marionette had adjusted itself without anyone touching it. Adam's stomach twisted in knots. The attic was growing colder, the light dimming, shadows crawling along the edges of the room. Get a grip, he muttered to himself. It's just an old doll. But when he turned his back, the feeling didn't go away. He tried to forget it, buried it under the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of the wind tapping at the windows. But as the days went by, that feeling grew. And it wasn't just the puppet anymore. It was everything. The marionette now sat on the mantelpiece, where Adam had placed it the night he brought it downstairs. He hadn't touched it since, hadn't given it a second glance, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was always there, always watching, its cold, glassy eyes following him. Sometimes, when he entered the room, it seemed to be slightly off-center, just a little to the left or right, as though someone had moved it when he wasn't looking. The worst part, it didn't feel like it was just observing, number. The feeling it gave him was much more sinister. He couldn't explain it, but it was like the puppet was waiting for something, waiting for him. It wasn't until the third night that things began to change. Adam had finally retired to his room after a long day of unpacking, the house dark and silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath the weight of his footsteps. He pulled the sheets up to his chin, settling into the bed, staring at the ceiling as his mind ran through the day's events. But there was no escaping it now. That puppet, that strange presence, was never far from his mind. He turned over in bed, eyes fixed on the faint outline of the marionette's silhouette from where it sat in the other room. He hadn't noticed before, but now he could have sworn the puppet's legs were bent at a strange angle, not in the usual stance it had been in the past few days. It wasn't just different, it felt alive, as though the puppet were stretching its limbs, preparing for something. And then, just as his eyes drifted shut, a sound shattered the silence. A soft creak, the sound of old wood, of something shifting. Adam's heart skipped a beat. He sat up in bed, blinking into the darkness, listening, waiting. The house creaked again, louder this time, as though something was moving. No, something was moving. A cold sweat broke out along his spine. The marionette. He had to check the marionette. Heart pounding, he threw back the covers and swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet touching the cold wood of the floor. The house groaned, but there was no sound of footsteps. Nothing. Stillness. The soft flickering light from the hallway cast long shadows as he stepped cautiously down the stairs. The silence was deafening now. Each step he took a weight on the old wooden staircase. The house seemed to be holding its breath, as if it, too, was waiting for something to happen. When Adam reached the living room, his breath caught in his throat. There, on the mantel, the marionette was no longer just sitting there. It was standing. The puppet's tiny wooden feet were now flat against the surface, its body upright, its strings now twisted in a way that no human hand could have made. The figure was leaning forward, its head tilted to one side, those glassy eyes staring directly at him. He had no idea how long he stood there, frozen in place, just staring at it. A strange tension coiled in his chest, a knot that tightened with each passing second. Then, in the deepest corner of his mind, a thought emerged, a whisper that made his heart freeze. "It's waiting for you." Before he could react, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then the strings moved. They shifted of their own accord, like the invisible hand of a puppeteer pulling them. Adam's body jerked in response. He didn't know why, but he raised his hand, mimicking the movements of the marionette, as though his body were no longer his own. And for the briefest moment, as the marionette's limbs twisted in eerie unison with his own, Adam understood the terrible truth. He wasn't in control anymore. The puppet wasn't just a toy. It was controlling him. And it wasn't done yet. Adam's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he stood frozen in the dimly lit living room, his eyes locked on the marionette. It was no longer a simple puppet. No, it had become something else. Its once innocent, lifeless form was now imbued with a malevolent energy, an energy that seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as his own heartbeat. The strings trembled as if alive, each movement of the puppet's limbs mirrored by his own, as though his body was no longer under his command. He jerked his hand back, breaking the strange, unnatural connection, but his fingers were still twitching, as if unwilling to stop the motion. He could feel the strings pulling him, tugging. Invisible threads wound themselves around his limbs, weaving tighter and tighter, slowly drawing him into their web. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to turn and flee, but his feet stayed rooted to the floor, as though they were being held down by some unseen force. And then it stopped. The strings went slack. The puppet slumped forward, its body heavy, lifeless again, as though the spell had broken. Adam's own body was his again. His arms fell to his sides, and he blinked, trying to shake the fog in his mind. It had all felt so real. He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Was it the puppet? Was it him? The room was silent now, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the only sound that broke the stillness. Adam didn't know how long he stood there, staring at the puppet, but it felt like an eternity. His heart was still racing, and his hands shook as he ran them through his hair, trying to calm himself. His reflection in the darkened windows seemed foreign to him, like a stranger, but it was just his own panic, distorting his perception. He had to do something. With a shaky breath, Adam turned and walked toward the marionette. The strings hung loosely now, a tangled mess of threads, as though the puppet had lost its purpose. It looked harmless again, just a piece of carved wood and string, a strange little relic from a time long past. He took a step closer and reached out with trembling fingers to grab it, but the moment his hand brushed against the puppet, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The puppet's eyes shifted. He jerked his hand back, startled, his breath catching in his throat. The marionette's eyes had never moved before, not that he could recall, yet now they were fixed on him, unwavering, their glassy depths hollow and unblinking. The little smile on its face twisted ever so slightly, like a smirk playing at the corners of its mouth. No, that wasn't right. It couldn't be right. Adam stepped back, his body reacting before his mind could process the thought. He couldn't look away from it, though. The strings were still hanging there, still connected to the marionette's body, and every fiber of his being screamed to break the connection, to sever the strings that tied him to this thing. But he didn't move. The feeling of control, of being forced into compliance, gripped him like an iron vice. It was then that he realized the truth, something that his mind had refused to accept up until now. The puppet was alive, not in the sense of beating heart or blood flowing through its wooden frame, but in a way that no rational person could explain. The puppet was manipulating him, but even worse, it wasn't just his physical actions, it was controlling. It was his thoughts, too. He could feel the shift in his mind, a tug, like a marionette string pulling at his very soul. Go to the kitchen, a voice whispered in his mind, as quiet and insistent as the tick of a clock. The command was simple, yet it felt like a force too powerful to resist. He could feel the compulsion creeping through him, curling around his brain like smoke, and for a moment, Adam thought he would obey. But something snapped in him. Something inside him rebelled. No, he whispered aloud, gritting his teeth. I'm not your puppet. His legs felt stiff, like they belonged to someone else, but he forced himself to move, to step back. The marionette didn't respond. It stayed there, motionless again, as if it had been waiting for him to make a choice. Adam could feel the air in the room growing colder, colder. The temperature seemed to drop with each step he took away from the puppet, as if the room itself was reacting to his defiance. But that was just the beginning. The next few days felt like a blur, an endless series of small, disorienting events that made Adam question his own sanity. The marionette was always there, sitting on the mantel, eyes staring into him as though waiting for something. At night, he could swear he heard the soft clicking of the strings moving, even though the puppet never moved from its perch. The first time it happened, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, he hadn't exactly slept well the night before. But then, it happened again and again, and the more it happened, the less he could deny that something was terribly wrong. The marionette had begun to move on its own, subtle shifts at first, nothing anyone else would notice. But to Adam, it was as clear as daylight. It was as though the puppet was shifting positions when he wasn't looking. An arm lifted just a fraction higher, a leg stretched just a little further. When he returned to the room, it was never exactly where he'd left it, and that's when it started happening to him. At first, it was so subtle he could ignore it. He'd walk into a room and find himself mimicking the puppet's stance, arms raised in an odd, stiff angle, fingers bent unnaturally at the joints. He would shake it off, try to convince himself it was nothing. But each time it happened, the movements became more forceful, more deliberate, until it wasn't just his body that was acting out of his control. It was his mind, too. At one point, Adam found himself standing at the sink, washing his hands. His fingers moved with a strange, jerky motion, mimicking the way the marionette's arms moved when it was suspended in midair. He stared at the reflection in the mirror, watching as his own hands obeyed some invisible force. His stomach churned with nausea, and it was all he could do not to scream. Then came the whisper. It wasn't a voice in the room, not exactly. It was a quiet murmur in the back of his mind, as though it had always been there, waiting for him to hear it. You're not in control. You never were. Adam shook his head violently, trying to dislodge the voice, but it only grew louder, clearer, like an old friend he never wanted to meet. The puppet was pulling his strings, and with each passing day, the puppet's hold over him grew stronger. His actions, his thoughts, his very will, all of it seemed to bend to the marionette's whims. Desperation crept into his bones, curling up like a sickness. He couldn't trust himself anymore. He couldn't trust his body. The puppet was controlling him, and the worst part was that it felt natural, like it was always meant to be this way. Each day that passed, the more he feared that he was losing himself, that soon there would be nothing left but the strings. Adam tried to fight it. He tried to disobey, but every time he did, the whispering would return, like a cold hand tightening around his throat. You belong to me now. There's no escaping it. It was becoming clear that there was no longer any way out. The puppet had taken more than his body. It was claiming his identity, his very soul. Adam could feel himself slipping away, becoming something less than human, less than himself, as the strings pulled tighter, and in the distance, the marionette waited, just waiting, for him to make the next move. Adam's reflection in the window wasn't his own anymore. He knew it, felt it in the pit of his stomach as he stood in front of the mirror, watching his hands tremble uncontrollably. His fingers twitched at strange angles, as though they had been bent by some invisible force, each movement unnatural, too deliberate. He wasn't alone in his own body. It was there with him, pulling the strings, making him move against his will. He had spent hours pacing the house that night, trying to lose himself in the stale air of the rooms, trying to escape the puppet's eyes that seemed to follow him everywhere. But it was no use. The marionette was always there, perched in the corner of his mind, lurking like a predator in the shadows, waiting for the moment it would strike again. The whispering had become louder, clearer, like the constant hum of a distant engine. It was inside his head now, echoing in his thoughts. It was no longer just a passive observer. It was controlling him. He tried to scream, tried to fight, but his mouth had clamped shut as if held by some invisible hand. You will do what I say. The marionette's words dripped through his thoughts like poison, cold and unyielding. It didn't matter where he went. It didn't matter how hard he tried to escape the strings that bound him. He could feel the pull, feel them tightening around him, every inch of him ensnared, every part of his body a puppet under its control. Adam had tried to break free. He tried to destroy the puppet, set it on fire, smashed it against the floor, torn the strings one by one. But nothing worked. Each time he thought he had destroyed it, it reappeared, undamaged, whole again, waiting. The puppet never changed. But Adam did. His fingers no longer responded to his commands. They moved when he told them not to. His legs jerked in strange, erratic motions. When he tried to sit still, his body would twitch, involuntarily pulling him into unnatural positions. The only thing that felt normal was when he gave in, when he stopped resisting, when he let the marionette guide his every move. He could feel himself slipping further away. Each time it took control, it pulled more from him, more of his identity, more of his sense of self. It was as though something was unraveling inside him, and no matter how hard he tried to hold it together, it was slipping through his fingers like sand. In the moments when he could still think clearly, Adam tried to figure out how the puppet had done this to him. Was it the strings? The twisted way they hung from its body, always alive, always moving when he wasn't looking? Or was it the puppeteer, the one who had created this cursed thing, who had poured some dark part of themselves into it, binding it with more than just wood and string? He didn't know. He wasn't sure if he even cared anymore. There were no more questions, no more answers. There was only the feeling of the strings, and the feeling of them tightening. And that night, after everything had gone quiet again, Adam found himself drawn back to the living room. It was an unnatural pull, an invisible force that guided him to the very center of the house, to the place where the puppet always waited. Even though he hadn't wanted to, his body carried him there, legs moving of their own accord, each step slower, heavier than the last. He stood before the marionette once again, feeling the coldness of its gaze on him. The puppet was sitting as it always did, its wooden limbs splayed out, the strings taut as though it had been waiting for him. This time, though, something was different. Adam could feel it, the change in the air. Something had shifted. The puppet was no longer just a figure, a lifeless thing bound by strings. It was alive. It was aware of him, watching him, expecting him. And for the first time, Adam felt something that chilled him more than he could have imagined, a sense of familiarity, like he'd been here before, like he'd done this before, but in a way that felt wrong, like he was caught in some cycle, some loop that he couldn't escape. His limbs jerked forward, and without thinking, his fingers wrapped around the strings. Stop, he tried to tell himself, but the voice in his mind was swallowed by a deeper command. His hand moved of its own accord, pulling the strings, setting the puppet into motion. It felt almost natural, the way his fingers guided the marionette. He moved it up and down, spinning it in circles, making it dance in the empty room as though it were a reflection of his own soul, tangled in knots. But it wasn't a puppet anymore. It wasn't a toy. It was him. The realization struck him with the force of a lightning bolt. He was no longer controlling the puppet. The puppet was controlling him. It wasn't the strings, not anymore. It was the puppeteer inside him, in his very mind, pulling his strings, twisting him into something unrecognizable. The marionette's movements, jerky and mechanical, were his own, and as he made the puppet spin and twist, his body moved in unison, following its every motion. I am the puppeteer now, the voice whispered again, calm and certain. Adam screamed, but his mouth didn't move. His mind, once so solid and intact, had fractured into something else. His own body was a foreign landscape, and he was nothing but a spectator, a shadow on the wall of his own life. He stumbled backward, pulling his hands away from the puppet, but his feet wouldn't stop. He was moving, running now, out of control, his body carrying him across the room as though someone else had taken over. The strings of his own being had been tied to the marionette, to the puppet master, and he was helpless to break free. The house felt different now. It wasn't just old and decaying. It was alive, breathing with the rhythm of his movements, pulsing with the dark energy that surrounded him. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they were closing in. The weight of the house, of the puppet, of the strings was suffocating him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. And just when he thought he might lose himself entirely, he felt a shift. The strings that held him began to pull harder, tighter, dragging him toward the mantel where the marionette sat, waiting, its eyes gleaming in the shadows. Adam's legs buckled beneath him, his body jerking uncontrollably as he was forced to his knees before it. The marionette's face grinned, twisted and cold. Its painted lips moved, forming the words that Adam knew by heart now, even though they had never been spoken aloud. "You're mine." Adam felt his mind shatter, and then, as if on cue, he stopped. The strings went slack, but he wasn't free. Not yet. The marionette was waiting for him to make the next move, waiting for him to dance, and Adam, broken and desperate, knew that he would, because there was no escape, not from the puppet, not from the puppeteer, and certainly not from the strings that held him tight. They were a part of him now, always. You said the stillness in the room had become suffocating. Adam's breath, shallow and rapid, caught in his throat as he stared at the marionette, its painted eyes staring back at him with a gleam that seemed to mock his every move. The strings, so familiar now, were pulled taut, stretching between the puppet's wooden limbs and the invisible hands that had already begun to control him. He could feel them, even now, tightening around him like the grip of an invisible giant. It had been days, weeks, maybe longer. Time seemed irrelevant now. The hours had blurred together in a haze of helplessness, and the constant weight in his chest, the pressure of knowing that his mind was no longer his own, never relented. It wasn't just his body that had been taken. It was his very soul. The voice in his mind had become louder, clearer, its commands more insistent. The marionette didn't need to say anything anymore. Adam could feel it in his skin, in his bones, in every breath he took. "You belong to me now." The whisper had become a constant hum, a reminder that there was no escape, no possibility of breaking free. He was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from, a puppet on a string, manipulated by something older and more powerful than he could ever understand. The house, too, had changed. The walls seemed to close in on him, pressing against him like a physical weight, as though they were part of the puppet's strings, drawing him ever closer. The house had become more than just a home. It was a prison, an endless stage where Adam was forced to play out his part. And the audience? It was the marionette, watching, waiting, with its cold eyes always fixed on him. Each movement of his body felt like a betrayal. He could no longer trust his own limbs. They jerked and twisted in ways they shouldn't, obeying the puppet's invisible commands. His hands reached out without his permission, performing actions he didn't want them to, like marionette strings, guiding him through the motions. Even when he closed his eyes, the puppet was there, lingering in the dark spaces of his mind. He was losing himself. There was nothing left with the puppet and the strings. Nothing but the constant pull of its control. But that night, when the cold fingers of the marionette's influence tightened around him once more, something shifted. Something deep inside Adam fought back. It started as a whisper, a faint thread of rebellion that barely reached his mind. It was a faint tug, like the feeling of an old, familiar memory, just out of reach. He couldn't quite grasp it at first, but it was there, hovering on the edge of his consciousness, like the flicker of a light just before it goes out. He shook his head violently, trying to dislodge the thought, but the whisper grew louder, stronger. The strings tugged, and his legs carried him toward the mantel. But this time, he didn't feel quite so helpless. He could feel it, the power of his own resistance, however small it was. No, Adam thought fiercely. I am not your puppet. It was only a fleeting thought, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that he was still in there, that there was still something left of himself, something untouched by the puppet's control. His fingers shook as he reached out, pulling the strings away from the puppet's wooden form, his mind and body working in unison to break free from the invisible force that had held him so tightly. But when his hands touched the strings, they resisted. They fought back, pulling him closer to the puppet, dragging him toward the stage, where his every move had been scripted. It was like trying to escape quicksand. The more he struggled, the more entangled he became. The strings wrapped around his wrists, his neck, pulling him back toward the puppet, toward the inescapable abyss. You can't fight me, Adam, the voice in his mind said, calm and cold. You never could. But Adam didn't listen. The whisper of resistance grew louder, filling the spaces between his thoughts, urging him on. His breath came in short bursts, his heart pounding in his chest as his mind fought to regain control. This wasn't just about his body anymore. It was about who he was, about taking back the pieces of himself that had been stolen, one string at a time. With a sudden, desperate burst of strength, Adam wrenched the strings free from the puppet's body. The puppet slumped forward, lifeless once again, but Adam's body didn't follow. He stood there, panting, sweat dripping down his face, his hands trembling as he clutched the loose threads in his fingers. For a moment, there was silence. The oppressive weight in the room seemed to lift, just a little, like a hand had been removed from his chest. He could hear his own breath, his heart beating in his ears. It was an unfamiliar sound, the sound of himself. He had done it. He had broken free. But the relief was short-lived. The air in the room shifted again. The temperature dropped. And then, slowly, it began to whisper again. A voice, low and insistent, filled his mind. You can't escape me, Adam. The puppet's body jerked, its wooden limbs twitching as though it had a life of its own. And the strings, those damn strings, began to slither back to their original positions. Adam felt the tug again, deeper now, more insistent, and it was all he could do to stay on his feet. His legs were shaking, his body betraying him, and the strings weren't just pulling at his body anymore. They were pulling at his mind, wrapping themselves around his thoughts, blurring the line between what was real and what was controlled. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. You belong to me, the voice whispered again. I made you. I own you. It was too much. Adam's knees buckled beneath him, and he fell to the floor, gasping for air. The strings wrapped around him once more, tighter this time, suffocating him in their invisible grip. The puppet's eyes, cold and dead, glinted in the dim light, watching him as though it were the one in control. For a moment, Adam felt his mind slipping. He could feel the puppet inside him, in his skin, in his thoughts. It wasn't just a toy anymore. It was him. It had always been him. The more he resisted, the more it took. There was no escape. There was only the puppet and the strings that bound him. The strings pulled tighter, and Adam, once so sure of his resistance, could feel the last of himself slipping away, consumed by the marionette's dark hold. His hands twitched, his body jerked, and the last shred of his consciousness screamed for freedom, only to be swallowed by the puppet's grip. And as his body jerked and twitched, the puppet's smile grew wider, crueler, its glassy eyes gleaming with satisfaction, because Adam knew, deep down, that there was no escaping the puppeteer's strings. Not now. Not ever. The puppet had won, and Adam was nothing but a marionette, pulled by strings, lost to the darkness forever. Adam's eyes fluttered open, though he wasn't sure how long it had been since he had closed them. He couldn't remember if it had been hours, days, or just moments. The weight in his chest remained, a constant, suffocating pressure. The strings once again were there. He could feel them, feel the pull on his mind, his body, so familiar now, so inevitable. They tugged at him with their invisible force, and no matter how much he tried to resist, no matter how desperately he tried to fight them, they always seemed to draw him back. The puppet sat at the edge of the room, its wooden face tilted slightly, as though it was waiting, watching, knowing. It had never stopped watching. Adam's hands, cold and stiff, twitched as he lay there on the floor, his body unwilling to obey him. It felt as if something inside him had shattered, that the last remaining piece of himself had crumbled into dust and was being swept away by the strings, by the puppet's unrelenting grip. He could feel his limbs beginning to move, slow at first, unwilling, but as the strings pulled tighter, as they wound around him like chains, he found himself rising, forced to his feet. His legs were weak, trembling under the weight of something that wasn't his own. His body felt heavy, foreign. He wasn't sure if it was still his body at all. The strings moved him now, commanded him, his movements jerky and uncontrolled. The puppet was in charge. Adam stood before the marionette, his hands reaching out as though they had a mind of their own, pulling the strings that bound him to the puppet, that tied him to the nightmare. He could see the way the puppet's painted face seemed to grin wider with each movement, its hollow eyes gleaming with malice. But there was something else, something new, a presence that had crept into the room, something darker, something that wasn't just the puppet, but the force behind it. "You are mine," the voice whispered in his mind again. "You have always been mine." But Adam didn't respond, didn't even feel the need to. The words were nothing more than a dull echo, distant now, as if they belonged to someone else. They had no power over him anymore, or at least he told himself that. He had resisted before, hadn't he? He had fought back, had tried to break free. He could do it again, but the strings didn't give him the chance. His hands jerked, forced to grip the puppet's strings tighter, and Adam could feel the familiar sensation of his body being moved, controlled, as if the strings were pulling his very soul along with them. It was suffocating, but it was also something else, something that felt oddly comforting. He had been lost for so long, drifting between his own thoughts and the marionette's pull, that it almost felt like returning home. The puppet's smile widened as Adam's hands moved on their own, guiding it into the motions, spinning it in slow, deliberate circles. He felt himself moving in time with the puppet, his body mimicking every gesture, every twist of its wooden limbs, as though he were an extension of it. And in that moment, Adam realized something. The puppet was him. But it wasn't just that. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He wasn't a puppet, nor a man, trapped in the dark marionette's grip. No, there was something deeper, something darker inside him now. The puppet had become part of him. Its strings had become part of his own mind. The more he fought, the more he resisted, the more he became its vessel. The puppet's strings, the ones that once trapped him in its dance, had changed him. They had twisted him into something else entirely. "You think you're free?" the voice whispered again, a faint, mocking laugh echoing behind it. "But there's no freedom here. Not for you. Not for me." Adam's body jerked again, his limbs moving in unnatural ways, forcing him to carry out movements he had never intended. His arms flailed, his legs twisted in impossible directions, and the puppet danced at his command, as though it were his mirror image. The wooden head tilted, the painted face forever locked in its mock grin. The pain in his chest deepened, but it was no longer physical. It was something else, something that gnawed at his soul, at the very core of his existence. He could feel his identity slipping away, his thoughts blending with the puppet's. He wasn't just dancing for it now. He was dancing with it, as if they were one. And that was the truth. The marionette was no longer a puppet. It had become a reflection of himself, twisted and distorted and held together by strings that had bound them both. He stumbled backward, fighting to stop, to break free. But the strings only pulled tighter. His body no longer obeyed him. It moved as the puppet moved, as it had always moved. His hand stretched out again, pulling the strings tighter, weaving them around his fingers, entangling himself in their grasp. But there was something else, something new. The strings didn't just control his movements now. They had dug deeper. They were weaving themselves into his thoughts, his memories, pulling from him the last remnants of who he had been before all this began. The puppet didn't need to be controlled anymore. It had taken him, consumed him, until the line between puppet and man was indistinguishable. Adam's eyes glazed over, his body jerking mechanically as the puppet led the dance. He could hear the voice again, low and deep, whispering in his mind, in his soul, echoing through every fiber of his being. "You are me. You have always been me." He couldn't feel his hands anymore, couldn't feel his feet. He was a shell, hollowed out, his mind lost to the rhythm of the puppet's dance. "I am the puppeteer." The voice coiled around him like a serpent, tightening its grip. "And you are my toy." Adam screamed in silence, but there was no escape. There was only the puppet, only the strings, only the dance. The world around him blurred into nothingness, his own body moving in time, with the marionette's every command. And as he spun, as his limbs twisted and jerked, the truth became clear. There was no freedom here. There was only the dance, and Adam would dance forever, because the puppet was never the toy. He was always the puppeteer. There's something about the smell of roses. At least, that's what Reeve thought. It was a scent that conjured up memories of summer, of the faintest sweetness that lingered in the air, lingering just long enough to make a person pause and take in the warm, delicate fragrance But this was something different, something wrong. This wasn't the smell of fresh roses. This was the unmistakable stench of decay, of something slowly rotting beneath the surface. It started small, barely noticeable really. Reeve would be sitting on the couch, flipping through channels late at night, when suddenly there'd be a faint whiff in the air, a scent that seemed to come out of nowhere. It was subtle at first, almost like the faintest hint of something sweet, something floral. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more persistent it became. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. Maybe it was the remnants of an old perfume left behind by the previous tenant. Or maybe the neighbor's flowers were somehow making their way through the cracks in the walls. The house was old, after all, but as the days passed, the scent didn't fade. It only grew stronger. Reeve tried to shake it off. He was a man of logic, of reason. He didn't believe in ghosts or things that went bump in the night. He believed in facts, in explanations that made sense. But this smell? It didn't make sense. There were no flowers in the house. There was no vase, no bouquet, nothing that could explain it. Yet every evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the smell would return, and every night it would grow stronger, more intense, until it seemed to fill every corner of the house. It was the third night in a row that Reeve first noticed how overpowering it had become. He had just sat down to dinner, the chicken sizzling in the pan, when the smell hit him like a slap in the face. His fork hovered midair, and he froze, his eyes scanning the room as if he expected to see the source of the stench hovering just out of sight. But nothing. He stood up, pushing the chair back so hard it scraped against the floor. "Where is it coming from?" he muttered to himself. There were no flowers in the house, no plants, nothing that could explain the smell. Still, it lingered, thick and nauseating, as if something was decaying just beyond his reach. He walked through the rooms, opening windows, checking vents, but the smell followed him, clinging to the air like an invisible presence. It was only when he reached the hallway, standing at the base of the stairs, that he stopped. The air was thick here, almost oppressive, as though the smell had gathered in this particular spot, like it had nowhere else to go. And then, for the first time, Reeve had an odd thought. What if it's not just the smell of dying roses? What if it's something else? He shook his head, trying to rid himself of the absurd thought. But even as he did, he couldn't deny the eerie feeling creeping over him. Something was wrong with this house. He could feel it in his bones. The air seemed heavier here, colder, despite the warmth of the evening. He turned and walked up the stairs, his feet dragging slightly with each step. The smell was stronger now, more pungent, but he couldn't tell exactly where it was coming from. It seemed to permeate everything, to suffuse the air as if the house itself had somehow absorbed the stench. Reeve paused at the top of the stairs, his eyes scanning the hallway in front of him. His gaze settled on the door to the attic, which was slightly ajar. The door had always been locked. Something about the attic felt off to him, but tonight, for some reason, it beckoned. The dim light of the hallway caught the brass handle, making it gleam in the darkness. He felt his stomach twist. Something wasn't right, but the smell, that damn smell, seemed to call him toward the attic. It pulled at him, an invisible force guiding his feet to the door. With a shaking hand, he pushed the door open. The attic was dark, save for the faint light of the moon, filtering through the small window at the far end. The air was cold up here, dust motes dancing in the moonlight as if caught in a delicate, forgotten ballet. And then there it was, that smell. The scent of decaying roses, now so strong that it made him gag. It was suffocating, heavy, as if the air itself was thick with the stench of something old and dead. Reeve hesitated in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath quickening with every passing second. There was something about this place, this attic, that unsettled him. He had always felt it, even when he first moved in. It had been locked when he came, the entryway to a space he hadn't thought to investigate. But now, the pull of the smell, the undeniable desire to understand where it was coming from, led him forward. He walked cautiously into the attic, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that had settled over everything. Boxes and old furniture were stacked haphazardly around the room, and the smell of decay grew stronger with each step he took. It seemed to come from everywhere. But then, as he reached the center of the room, he saw it. A vase. At first, he thought it was just another old decoration, perhaps something left behind by the previous owners. But the sight of it made his blood run cold. It was a tall, antique vase, cracked and weathered with age, its surface covered in a fine layer of dust. But it wasn't the vase itself that caught his attention. It was the flowers inside, a bouquet of roses, dead roses, their petals wilted and curling at the edges, their color faded to a sickly brown. But it wasn't just the roses that disturbed him. It was the tags tied to each of the dead flowers. There were 5 roses in total, and each one had a tag, neatly written in fading ink. Reeve's heart skipped a beat as he read the first name, Marlene Hayes. He didn't recognize the name. The second tag, James Franklin. The third, Lucy Radford. Then a fourth, Richard Moore. And the fifth, his stomach twisted violently as he read it, Reeve Walker. The name on the tag was his own name. His pulse pounded in his ears, and he reached for the vase, his hands trembling as he picked it up. The roses crumbled in his grip, their petals falling apart like dried paper. His mind raced. How could this be possible? Why would his name be on one of the roses? And more importantly, who had left this here? The smell of decaying roses filled his nostrils, suffocating him. And for the first time in weeks, Reeve realized something terrible. The smell wasn't just in the house, it was in him, too. The roses, these dead, wilting flowers, had always been here, and they weren't just a coincidence. They were waiting for him. Reeve staggered back, the vase slipping from his fingers and shattering against the floor. The pieces of glass glinted in the dim light as the roses crumbled into dust. And in that moment, he understood. He wasn't the one who had been waiting for the roses. The roses had been waiting for him, and death was calling. The jagged shards of the broken vase scattered across the attic floor, glistening in the faint moonlight. Reeve stared at the remains, unable to move, as if his body had suddenly become a stranger to him. The roses were gone now, their crumbled petals mixed in with the glass. The smell of decaying flowers lingered in the air, suffocating, heavy with an unbearable weight. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that fills a room with the echoes of forgotten things, of things you never wanted to remember. It pressed against his chest, making it harder to breathe. Reeve's pulse hammered in his ears, his mind reeling, scrambling to make sense of what he'd just seen. His name. His own damn name. He could feel it now. That strange pressure in the back of his throat. A feeling that had been building up since he first noticed the smell. Since the roses first began to haunt him. This wasn't just some trick of the mind. This was real. He was tied to these flowers in a way he couldn't explain, and it terrified him. The attic around him seemed to grow colder. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, to stretch out toward him, like something alive, as if they were trying to draw him back into the darkness. He took a step back, but his legs felt heavy, as though the air itself had become thick and sticky, making movement feel like wading through syrup. But there was something worse, something even more disturbing than the rotting roses. It was the realization that those names on the tags weren't just random. They weren't just some twisted coincidence. No, they were connected to him, in a way he couldn't deny. Marlene Hayes, James Franklin, Lucy Radford, Richard Moore. Each of them had died before their time, according to the faded ink on the tags. Each of them had been marked by death, an early, violent, or mysterious end, and Reeve had no idea how he was connected to them, or why his name had been added to the list. He took another unsteady step back, eyes darting around the room, but the attic felt claustrophobic now, as if the walls were inching closer, pressing in from all sides. There was nowhere to run. He had to leave. He had to get out of this place. But as he turned, ready to flee, something caught his eye. Something that had been there all along, but had remained hidden until now. At the far side of the attic, almost obscured by a stack of old crates and boxes, was another object. A small, tarnished mirror. The kind of mirror you find at flea markets or estate sales. The kind that nobody wants because it's been passed over 100 times, forgotten in some corner of the world. But now it was different. It was glowing, faintly, as though it had absorbed the moonlight, as though it was alive. Reeve's heart lurched in his chest. He didn't want to go near it. He didn't want to look, but his feet were already moving. It was as if some force beyond his control was guiding him, pushing him toward it, compelling him to see whatever was waiting. The smell of decaying roses grew stronger the closer he got, thickening the air, curling into his nostrils like a phantom's touch. It was suffocating him now. It was everywhere. And as he stood before the mirror, staring into its tarnished surface, he felt something stir within him. It wasn't a reflection. Not really. It was something else. Something watching him. He leaned forward, unable to look away. And then, in the murky glass, he saw them. The names. Again. But this time, they were different. The names on the tags didn't just sit there in the mirror's surface. They moved. The letters seemed to shift, to rearrange themselves before his eyes, as if the names were alive, written in blood. The ink swirled and blurred, forming new patterns, new sequences, and for the briefest of moments, he could almost hear the whispers of the dead. Reeve stumbled back, his heart slamming in his chest. His breath came in ragged gasps, and the darkness of the attic seemed to close in even tighter. The whispering was louder now, growing clearer with every passing second. Reeve ... The voice wasn't his own. It was a hollow, disembodied sound, like 1,000 whispers gathered together, curling around him. Reeve, you can't escape. His pulse quickened, the air grew colder, and the stench of roses seemed to burn in his lungs now. He gasped for breath, but it was like inhaling thick tar. The words continued to swirl, each whisper curling around him until he thought his mind would snap. The roses are waiting, Reeve, waiting for you. He could hear footsteps behind him, soft, shuffling steps, like someone moving slowly through the dust of the attic. His stomach churned, and he dared not turn around. He didn't need to. He knew the truth now. The attic wasn't empty. Not anymore. There were things here, watching him, waiting. Who are you? His voice was barely a whisper, a crack in the otherwise suffocating silence. His body was trembling now, every nerve on fire as he stood rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe. The footsteps stopped, and then there was silence. For a long, terrible moment, Reeve thought that maybe the terror had passed, that maybe he was just imagining it all, that maybe, just maybe, he could run out of here and forget all of it. But he didn't. The moment of stillness was shattered by a single, soft sound, a creaking noise, as if something heavy had shifted just behind him. Reeve whirled around, heart racing, his eyes scanning the shadows. But there was nothing except the mirror. The names were still there, but now they had changed. They weren't just names anymore. They were dates of death. Marlene Hayes, May 17th, 1984. James Franklin, October the 12th, 1993. Lucy Radford, January 6th, 2007, 2001. Richard Moore, August 21st, 2010. And then the last one, his name, written in bold, stark letters. The ink seemed to drip, spreading across the surface of the glass like blood. Reeve Walker, March 4th, 2022. A chill ran through him, cold as ice, as he read the date. That was the day, his day, the day he would die. He staggered back, shaking his head, unable to process the words. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't. But as he looked into the mirror again, he knew. He knew that the roses were waiting for him, just like the others. The dead were calling. Their names had been written in the dark, and they wouldn't let him go. The attic grew colder still, and Reeve knew, deep in his gut, that there was no escaping this fate. Not anymore. The roses had already claimed him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The cold in the attic was unbearable now. The air itself seemed to be choking him, thick with the acrid scent of death. Reeve's breath came in short, frantic gasps, each inhale making his chest feel tighter, as though the very atmosphere was trying to suffocate him. His legs felt like lead, and the darkness pressed in around him like a vice, closing him in from all sides. The mirror gleamed, mocking him in the dim light. His name was there, written in blood-red ink, a date that was far too close for comfort. March 4th, 2022. His mind spun. He didn't know what to do. His hand trembled as it reached out toward the mirror, almost as if it had a life of its own, a life that was desperate to see more, to confirm the truth of what he was seeing. But even as his fingers grazed the surface, he pulled back with a hiss of disgust. The coldness of the mirror seemed to bite into his skin, sending a shock through his spine. "Get a grip," he muttered, his voice shaking. "This isn't real. It's not real." But deep down, in the pit of his stomach, Reeve knew that it was. It was real. The smell of decaying roses wasn't just some figment of his imagination. It was a warning. The names, the dates, everything in this house was connected, like some vast, unseen web of fate, and he was caught in it. The attic felt like a trap now, a place where time itself had stopped, where the past and the future collided in a twisted, nightmarish mess. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that followed was no better. It was the kind of silence that pressed against you, a presence that was felt but not seen, a weight that anchored you in place, made it impossible to move. For a moment, Reeve stood frozen, unable to tear his eyes away from the mirror. The reflection seemed to pulse with a dark energy, like it was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. He should have left. He should have run out of that attic and never looked back. But there was something pulling him back toward the mirror, something stronger than fear, curiosity, desperation, a need to understand. "What the hell is this?" he whispered aloud, his voice cracking with the weight of his own dread. "What's happening to me?" The words echoed in the attic, bouncing off the walls in a way that seemed unnatural, as if the space itself was alive, breathing with him, waiting for him to give in to it. And then, as if in response to his question, the air around him shifted. A low hum filled the room, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was a sound that seemed to come from deep within the walls, from beneath the floorboards, as if the house itself was alive, shifting and groaning under the weight of something ancient. Reeve's heart raced in his chest. He turned, eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for something, anything, that could explain the sound, the feeling of something crawling in the shadows, something watching him from the dark. But there was nothing, just the remnants of the broken vase, the scattered petals, the jagged glass, the mirror. He knew he couldn't stay here. He couldn't stay in this house any longer, not with this feeling gnawing at him, not with the smell of roses choking him every time he took a breath. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening. He needed to know who had left the roses in the attic, and why his name had been written on that last flower. But as he turned to leave, a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. It was faint at first, so quiet that he almost thought it was his imagination. A rustling, like paper being crumpled, followed by the faintest whispering. And then the smell. It grew stronger, flooding the air, thickening around him. It was more potent now, more insistent, and for the first time, Reeve realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't just the roses in the attic that smelled. It was him. He smelled like death now. He could feel it, creeping into his skin, into his bones. The roses had already begun their work, their poison slowly seeping into his body, into his soul. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. The ghosts of those who had died before their time, Marlene, James, Lucy, Richard, were here with him, watching him, waiting for him. "It's too late," the voice inside his head whispered. "You're already part of it." The attic door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash, the sound echoing like thunder. Reeve jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. He whirled around, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but the door was still locked, sealed shut. There was no escape. The air grew colder, and the smell of roses thickened until it became nauseating, a pungent, rotting stench that filled his nostrils and made his eyes water. Reeve felt his legs give out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the floor. The cold, dust-ridden boards pressing against his palms as he struggled to breathe. "It's over," the voice whispered again. "It's all been written. Your fate is sealed." Reeve's eyes darted to the broken vase, the shards of glass still scattered on the floor. The petals had dissolved completely now, but the tag attached to the last rose, his rose, was still visible, still clinging to the remnants of the stem. He reached for it, trembling, his fingers brushing against the brittle paper. His heart thudded in his chest as he read the date again, the date that seemed to burn itself into his mind. March 4th, 2022. It was today. It wasn't just a name. It wasn't just a date. It was a countdown that had already begun. And once it reached its end, he would be just another name on the list, just another soul claimed by the roses. But the thought of death wasn't what terrified him most. No, what truly frightened him was the realization that he couldn't escape it. The roses had already begun their work. The attic had become his tomb, a prison where time stood still, and death's shadow loomed closer with every passing second. And worse still, he couldn't remember if he ever truly wanted to escape. It was as if the house, the roses, had already begun to rewrite him. Everything he had thought to be true, the man he had been, slipping away, unraveling in the face of something much darker than he could comprehend. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the mirror. The names had changed again. His name was still there, but now it had a new tag, deceased. The smell of roses filled his lungs one last time. And then, nothing. Reeves' eyes opened, but it was like the world around him was nothing but a haze, a fog that clung to his senses, distorting everything. His body felt numb, as though it no longer belonged to him. The attic wasn't quite real anymore. It was just a fractured memory, an impression that left a taste of fear on his tongue. But that smell, the stench of decaying roses, it was as real as ever, thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around his mind. He blinked, struggling to pull himself together. The mirror was there, looming like an old friend, but it wasn't just a mirror anymore. It had become something more, something sinister. Reeve couldn't remember when it had stopped being a reflection of his own image, but now it felt as if it had absorbed everything around it, everything that had ever been. The roses weren't gone. No, they lingered, hovering just beneath the surface of the glass. Their faded petals caught in the reflections, their dark stems twisting like veins, pulsing with a life of their own. The names, they were still there too, but now they were changing, twisting, rearranging in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It was as though the mirror had become a living thing, a distorted version of reality that refused to let him escape. He stood shakily, his body protesting the effort, but he couldn't stop himself. I had to get away. He had to leave this place, but his legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place by something far more powerful than fear. But before he could make a move, the floorboards creaked beneath him, a sound so slight, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Reeves' heart skipped a beat, and his body went rigid. He wasn't alone. Something was here, something that had always been here. The whispering began again, soft at first, like the rustle of dry leaves being blown across a quiet road. Then it grew louder, more insistent, more focused. Words, barely audible, as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate with him, but each time it felt just out of reach. Reeve, the name rang in his ears, a soft echo, a warning. His breath caught in his throat, and his hands trembled at his sides. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the coldness, the presence, it was all too real to ignore. He turned slowly, dread crawling up his spine, his eyes darting toward the source of the sound. The attic had shifted again. It wasn't the same space he had come into. The walls seemed to have grown closer, the air thinner, the shadows longer. The crates and boxes that had once been stacked neatly against the far wall were now spread out like scattered corpses. Every object seemed wrong, as if it had been moved deliberately. He wasn't alone in this house anymore. He never had been. Reeve staggered back, his feet stumbling over the broken vase's shards. His body a fragile vessel, caught in the grip of something far more ancient than he was. The whispers grew louder, clearer, until they no longer sounded like whispers at all. They were voices. No, screams, pleading, crying, warning him. But the words were foreign, distorted, as though they were coming from the other side of a great chasm. "Help me!" Reeve's head snapped around, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the attic, searching for the source of the sound. He thought he saw something, movement, shifting in the shadows, but when he blinked, it was gone. And then, his gaze fell back on the mirror. There was something different about it now. It was no longer just reflecting the dim light from the room. Now it was glowing, faintly at first, but steadily brightening, as if the glass itself had begun to breathe. The reflection, it wasn't his own, not anymore. It was the reflection of a woman he didn't recognize. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with dark circles under her eyes. Her lips were parted, as though she was speaking, but no sound came out. Her eyes, however, were fixed on him, cold, empty, and full of an unspeakable sorrow. Reeve took a step forward, his heart hammering against his chest. Was this another trick of the mind? Another hallucination caused by the roses? But the woman in the mirror wasn't some figment of his imagination. She was real. He could feel it deep in his gut. The roses. There was something in those roses. They were tied to everything. The smell, the mirror, the voices, and to this woman in the glass. As if summoned by his thoughts, the woman's lips began to move. The words were silent, but Reeve could read them in the reflection. "Help me. Save me." And then, in a moment of sickening clarity, Reeve realized that she wasn't asking for help. She was begging him to join her. The reflection twisted, shifting like liquid glass, and before he could react, the woman's face was gone. In her place, the roses returned, their petals curling and decaying in real time. Each flower's petals seemed to be eaten away by some unseen force, leaving only blackened remnants. And then it hit him. The roses weren't a symbol of death. They were a gateway. The names, the dates, those weren't just random. They were the lives of people who had been claimed by the roses before him. Each rose represented a person who had been marked for death long before their time. The roses had a purpose, a malevolent purpose, to tie souls to their decaying embrace and trap them in the web of death they wove. Reeve's breath quickened. His head spun. The reality around him seemed to dissolve, becoming nothing but shifting shadows and distorted reflections. It was as though the attic of the house, the world itself, was beginning to unravel at the seams. He stumbled back toward the stairs, his mind a mess of conflicting thoughts. He didn't know how he could escape. He didn't even know if he wanted to escape. There was something deep inside of him that whispered that he belonged here, that he had always belonged here, that the roses had chosen him for a reason. But he couldn't let that happen, not without a fight. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The door to the attic slammed open with a deafening crash. Reeve's heart lurched in his chest. He couldn't stay here, not with the roses, not with whatever was pulling him toward them. But as he turned toward the door, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood in the doorway. A man, tall, cloaked in shadow, with eyes like pools of blackness. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at Reeve as though he were an old acquaintance. And then the roses in the mirror bloomed again, their petals twisting. A name appeared, etched in the mirror's surface. Reeve Walker. The date, March 4th, 2022. And beneath it, the words began to form, soft and chilling. You were always meant to join us. The figure in the doorway didn't move. It was as if he were a part of the darkness itself, an extension of the shadows that crept along the walls, stretching longer and darker with each passing moment. Reeve felt his heart seize up in his chest, the air growing colder, thicker. His feet were frozen to the floor as if some unseen force had anchored him in place. His breath came in short, desperate bursts, but the air in the attic had turned suffocating, thick with the scent of roses and death. "Who are you?" Reeve rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper, a tremor running through his entire body. He wanted to shout, to run, but his limbs refused to obey. It was like the man in the doorway held the strings of his movements, like some dark puppeteer pulling the cords, drawing him closer to the inevitable. The man's eyes, blacker than the deepest void, gleamed with something unfathomable. They bored into Reeve, as if looking right through him, as if they could see every secret, every hidden fear he had ever tried to bury deep within himself. "You know who I am," the man said softly, his voice smooth and dark, like velvet wrapped around a blade. "And you know what's coming." Reeve's pulse thrummed in his ears. "I know." How could he know? The words echoed in his mind, twisting like thorns, pulling him into a vortex of confusion and fear. The roses in the mirror seemed to grow taller, their stems twisting like serpents, their petals curling and decaying with a sickening speed. The smell, that overwhelming stench of death, became almost unbearable. It clawed at his senses, digging into his skin, into his soul, filling every breath with the suffocating weight of fate. "You've been marked, Reeve," the man continued, taking a step forward, his shadow seeming to stretch with him, curling around the edges of the room. "From the moment you stepped foot into this house, you sealed your fate. The roses chose you. You were always meant to be a part of them." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Reeve wanted to scream, to deny it, but a cold, crushing realization settled over him. There was no denying it. The roses, the mirror, the names, they were all part of something larger, something that had been slowly, relentlessly, pulling him into its grasp. He had tried to resist, tried to outrun it, but it had always been there, lurking in the corners of his life, waiting for the right moment to strike. "No," he croaked, shaking his head in disbelief. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of this." The man's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile, one that chilled Reeve to his very core. "It doesn't matter whether you asked for it. It was never about what you wanted. It's about what was always meant to be. The roses are part of a pattern, an inevitable cycle of life and death. Your name, your soul, they were always destined to be woven into it." Reeve could feel the weight of the words, their truth pressing in on him. He could feel the pull of something ancient, something beyond his understanding, that had been shaping his every move, guiding him like a marionette in a story he had never known he was part of. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was a portal, a window into the darkness that had always been waiting for him. The air was thick with the scent of roses now, overpowering, suffocating, filling his nostrils with the taste of decay. The petals were falling, crumbling into dust, and in the reflection, Reeve could see them, his own image, but it was different now. His face was pale, his eyes wide and hollow, as if the life had already begun to drain from him. And in his reflection, there was something else, someone else, a shadow, darker than the night, standing behind him, reaching out with skeletal hands. "You think you can escape this," the man said, his voice low and almost pitying. "But it's too late. The roses have claimed you. You've already begun to fade, Reeve. There's no going back." Reeve took a step backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He could feel the air growing colder, the shadows creeping in closer, suffocating him. He had to get out of here. He had to escape. But when he turned to flee, his body froze, as if held in place by some unseen force. His feet felt heavy, weighed down by the oppressive presence of the man in the doorway, by the roses, by everything that had led him to this moment. "You don't have to fight it," the man said, his voice smooth as silk. "You never did." Reeve's chest tightened. The weight of the words pressed down on him like a vice, each syllable suffocating him, taking away his will to resist. He wanted to scream, to fight, but it felt pointless, like punching a wall made of steel. There was no escaping the darkness, no escaping the roses. The reflection in the mirror shifted again, the roses blossoming, their petals darkening with age, their stems twisting and writhing like serpents. And in the reflection, Reeve saw something that made his blood run cold. His name, written on a tag, attached to one of the dead flowers. But it wasn't the name he had known. It was a different name, a new name. His name was fading, being replaced by something darker, something that didn't belong to him. It was then that he understood. The roses didn't just take life, they rewrote it. The lives of those who fell under their curse were twisted, distorted, erased from existence, and replaced with something darker, something that could never be undone. Reeve wasn't just marked for death. He was being absorbed, his identity lost in the cycle, replaced by something else entirely. "Please," Reeve gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't want this. I don't want to be part of this." The man's face softened, a cruel smile playing at the edges of his lips. "It doesn't matter what you want. It's already been decided." The roses in the mirror bloomed once more, their petals stretching, reaching toward him. And then, slowly, impossibly, they began to move, their petals shifting, their stems curling like fingers, reaching for Reeve, pulling him toward them. He struggled, his body fighting against the invisible force that bound him in place. But it was useless. He was already slipping away, his body fading into the dark embrace of the roses. His vision blurred, his mind spinning, and all that remained was the overwhelming stench of decaying flowers and the cold hand of fate. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was his own name, written in the mirror alongside the date, March 4th, 2022. The roses had claimed him. There was no escape. It started on a Tuesday. At least, that's when Simon could trace it back to. The day everything changed, though he didn't know it at the time. He hadn't given the woman a second thought, Not after her strange, unsettling words as she handed him the bundle of apples. Just a strange old woman, another face in the market crowd, the kind you'd see, blink at, and forget within a minute. But that was before his skin began to shimmer, before it felt like something was crawling beneath it, something that was alive. Simon hadn't noticed the first signs right away. It was just a glimmer, a faint shimmer under the harsh fluorescent lights in his kitchen that caught his eye as he was putting the apples into the fridge. He didn't think much of it, just an odd reflection, maybe a trick of the light. After all, it was nothing more than a couple of spots on his arm, small, almost invisible. But by the next morning, he noticed it had spread. The glimmering was more pronounced now, a thin layer of something that looked like oil coating his forearm. His first thought was that he had touched something greasy without realizing it. He'd been in the market for a while, after all, and it wasn't unheard of to come into contact with something sticky. But when he washed his arm, the oil didn't go away. In fact, it only seemed to spread. It wasn't grease. It was something else entirely, something that shimmered in a way that wasn't quite right. He ran his fingers over his skin, and the strange, slick sensation made his stomach turn. His fingers seemed to stick to the surface, as if the skin wasn't quite his own anymore. The way it moved when he flexed his hand, it didn't feel like his hand. It felt like it was being pulled. The skin felt tighter, stretched almost, as if something underneath was pushing. Simon stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, a sliver of light from the window filtering in. His face was the same. He looked the same. But his skin wasn't the same. His jaw tightened, and his breath hitched as he ran a hand over his cheek. A thin, viscous sheen covered it, just like the spot on his arm. His reflection appeared foreign, a stranger's face. His skin shone faintly under the bathroom light, like a thin layer of something slick was resting beneath the surface. Panic gnawed at him, but he pushed it down. Just some weird reaction, maybe. Something in the air, or the food, or... He stopped himself. His mind was racing, but he needed to keep it together. There had to be an explanation. The old woman at the market hadn't been much of a presence. She was just one of the vendors, set up near the back of the market where the aisle narrowed, near the dusty corner where the stale scent of old paper and wood mingled with the smells of overripe fruit. Simon had never paid much attention to her before, but that day she had been waiting for him. Her pale, wrinkled face was too still as she reached out to him with an almost uncanny calm. "You'll want these, young man," she had said in a raspy, whispery voice, thrusting a bag of apples into his hands. He could still see her eyes, pale and unblinking, and the deep creases that lined her face. There was something too still about her, as though she had been watching him for a very long time, even though they had never met before. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that left him unsettled. And then she said something, just before he turned to leave, something that didn't make sense at the time, but that now lingered in the back of his mind, like a curse. "Don't look at the mirror too long. It will see you," she had rasped, her voice low and tremulous. "It will claim you, boy. When you see the glimmer, you won't be yourself anymore." He hadn't understood her words then, but the more he looked at his skin in the mirror, the more they echoed in his mind. Don't look at the mirror too long. It will see you. It had sounded like nonsense. Old woman rambling, maybe. Nothing to take seriously. But now he couldn't shake the feeling that her words had been prophetic, as if she had known, as if she had seen it coming. This terrible thing that was happening to him. The glimmer on his skin wasn't just a strange reflection anymore. It was spreading, moving across his body, creeping down from his arms, up his neck, and over his chest, until it seemed like his entire body was coated in a thin, sickly sheen. And the sensation, it was growing more insistent. Every movement felt wrong, like he wasn't in full control of his own body. It was as if something was crawling beneath his skin, something that was pushing, pulling, controlling him. He could feel it in the tips of his fingers now, the subtle tugging sensation, as though they were no longer his own. He flexed his hand, his fingers curling involuntarily, like they were being directed. The same thing was happening with his legs. His knees ached with the strain of movements that felt foreign. When he walked, his feet didn't quite hit the floor with the usual weight. They hovered for a moment, and then slammed down with an odd, detached force. Something was moving beneath him, beneath the skin. Simon backed away from the mirror, his pulse quickening, his breath shallow. His heart was racing, and yet he didn't feel like he had control over his own movements anymore. There was a disconnect between his brain and his body, like the skin that covered him was no longer just skin. It was alive in a way that wasn't natural, alive in a way that filled him with growing dread. He ran to the kitchen, his mind a fog of panic and confusion. The tap was running, and the sound of water splashing against the sink made him flinch. He splashed cold water on his face, hoping to wash away the slickness, but the moment the water touched his skin, it didn't work. It just seemed to spread, flowing over his skin like oil, growing thicker. The water didn't wash it away. It just made it worse. He gripped the edge of the sink with trembling hands, his reflection distorting in the slick surface of the mirror. The glistening wasn't just on the surface now. It was beneath the skin, too. Simon could feel it, like fingers tracing the inside of his flesh, moving beneath the surface as if to manipulate him. The sensation was alien, wrong, and it was spreading, pushing its way deeper, seeping into his very muscles and bones. He tried to breathe through the panic. He wasn't thinking straight. He had to think. He grabbed a washcloth, pressing it against his face, rubbing with frantic, desperate movements, trying to scrub it away. It wouldn't go. It only made the slickness spread, the oil seeping across his jaw, his chin, his neck, and then it started to burn, just slightly. A pinprick sting, as if the very skin was resisting his touch. Simon recoiled, throwing the washcloth away. He stared at his hands, flexing them in disbelief. The glistening was worse now. It had spread, up his arms, across his chest, like something living, crawling under the surface of his body. He could see it moving now, faintly, just beneath his skin, like shadows slipping between the layers of tissue and bone. His legs gave way. He crumpled to the floor, his body shaking uncontrollably as the sensation of the creeping movement intensified. Something inside him seemed to be clawing for freedom, pushing against the skin, trying to break out. He gasped, breath coming in ragged gasps, unable to hold it together any longer. The glimmer, the old woman's warning, the creeping, crawling sensation beneath his skin. The transformation was happening, and it wasn't stopping. And worst of all, he realized, was that it wasn't just happening to his body. It was taking over his mind, too. It had been 3 days since the first signs of the transformation began, and Simon had no idea what he was supposed to do anymore. The glistening had only worsened, spreading over his body like a crawling fever. He had tried everything to wash it off, scrub it away, soap, water, even rubbing alcohol, but nothing worked. It was as if his skin had become an impenetrable barrier, a second layer that he couldn't tear away. It was worse than oil, worse than sweat or grime. It felt alive. Simon could feel it moving under his skin, pushing and pulling, a constant pressure that left him exhausted, drained, as though his body was not entirely his own anymore. Each time he looked in the mirror, his reflection was a little different. Not just the glimmer of his skin, but his eyes. They had started to look distant, as though he wasn't seeing himself clearly anymore, as though his mind was fogged by something just outside his reach. The worst part was the sensation. It was like his body was betraying him, moving without his permission. His hands, for example, no longer followed his thoughts. They'd start to twitch, fingers jerking involuntarily, like marionette strings were pulling at them. When he tried to stop them, to force his body to obey, it only seemed to make it worse. The movements were subtle at first, like a tremor too small to notice, but now it was undeniable. It wasn't just his hands. His legs were worse. The muscles in his thighs seemed to be shifting. He'd been walking around the house, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease that wrapped around him like a blanket of damp dread, when he stumbled. His right leg had jerked out in front of him, as if it had a mind of its own. His body lurched, and he barely caught himself on the wall, his heart hammering in his chest. It wasn't just a cramp or some muscle spasm. It felt intentional, like something was guiding him, pulling at his joints. That night, as the glimmering continued to intensify, Simon found himself in the kitchen again, staring down at his reflection in the darkened window above the sink. It wasn't a reflection anymore, not in the way it used to be. His skin, once pale and plain, now gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. But it wasn't the shine that made his stomach twist. It was the pattern. The skin was shifting. The glimmer wasn't just superficial. It was deep, like veins of liquid silver running through his flesh. It didn't feel like his skin anymore. It was as if something was growing under it, pushing it outwards, swelling in slow, unnatural pulses. He pressed a hand to his chest, his breath shallow and ragged, and the skin beneath his fingers felt thick, unnaturally firm, like a sheet of plastic. He could feel it moving beneath the surface, twitching, crawling. The first real panic attack hit him a few hours later. He couldn't breathe. The air in his apartment seemed too thick, the walls pressing in on him as if they were closing around him, suffocating him. His skin burned, itching as if fire ants were crawling under it, but he couldn't scratch it away. The more he tried to force his hands to stop, the more they moved of their own accord. He slapped them away, trying to control them, but they just jerked and twitched more, like they had a mind of their own. His heart raced and sweat poured down his neck. He looked at his arms, his hands, his legs, his entire body, and saw the glimmering sheen spreading. The veins underneath seemed too pronounced, as if the skin was too thin, as though his body was being eaten alive from the inside out. In the dim light, the sensation of creeping movement under his skin was overwhelming. It was as if thousands of tiny, unseen hands were reaching through the tissue, brushing against his bones, pulling his muscles. He looked at his own reflection in the darkened window above the sink. His face stared back at him with wide, panicked eyes. But the longer he stared at it, the more strange it seemed. He was still him, wasn't he? But he couldn't feel himself anymore. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time Simon closed his eyes, he could feel it moving beneath his skin, twisting, pulling, like some parasite was nesting in his body. He had nightmares, though they felt more like vivid memories, as though the dark thing inside him was pulling him into an alternate reality where he was someone else. The worst of it came around 2 a.m., when Simon woke up suddenly, his body trembling uncontrollably. He shot up in bed, his eyes darting around the room. The sensation was unbearable now. His skin was hot, too hot, and it was shifting, sliding like liquid under his fingertips as he tried to hold himself still. His legs burned as though they were being pried apart, and his arms felt heavy, almost like weights were strapped to them. The movement underneath him was no longer subtle. It was constant, like a drumbeat, an insistent thrum that pulsed through him. He had to get it out, get it off. He staggered to the bathroom, his movements jerky and uncontrolled. He turned the shower on, but even the water couldn't cool his skin. He felt the muscles in his arms pulling, stretching, and his joints popped unnaturally, as though something were trying to push its way out of him. Then he saw it. The first crack appeared on the back of his hand. It was tiny at first, a faint fissure in his skin, just barely visible. But it grew quickly, the edges widening, as though his skin were splitting apart. Beneath it, there was a gleam of something darker, something like oil, but it was black, slick, and moving, pulsing as though something was slithering underneath his skin, trying to break free. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, Simon thought he might pass out. He stepped back from the mirror, his body seizing with terror. He had never seen anything like this in his life. His face was a mask of panic, but he could feel his muscles tightening, the pressure building as if something inside him was demanding to be let out. He pressed a hand to the crack, hoping to stop it, but it didn't work. The crack widened with a sickening sound, like dried clay breaking open, and the black fluid began to ooze out of him, creeping across the back of his hand, seeping down his wrist, coating his arm like a slow, suffocating tide. And that was when he heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, a low, slithering hiss that seemed to come from within him, from somewhere deep inside, like a voice too quiet to understand. But it was there, undeniable. "We're taking you," it murmured, low and guttural, like the scrape of metal on bone. Simon's heart slammed against his rib cage as he backed away from the mirror, his eyes wide with terror. He turned his gaze downward, where his body had begun to shift, his skin moving, rippling like something alive, something not him. And as he watched, his arms twisted with unnatural force, his fingers clenched, his muscles strained, and the voice whispered again, louder this time, clearer. "You're ours now. You will never be you again." The days blurred together after that. Simon had long since lost track of time, unable to remember when it was light or dark, or what day of the week it had been since the night he'd stood in front of the bathroom mirror, watching the cracks split open on his skin. There were no more thoughts of going outside. He had no reason to. The world beyond the walls of his apartment had ceased to exist. Or perhaps it was that he couldn't stand the thought of what might be waiting for him out there, waiting to see the horror that had already taken root in him. It wasn't just his skin anymore. His body was changing. The transformation, if you could call it that, was accelerating. The black oil beneath the cracks in his skin pulsed with a life of its own, slow and steady, like the rhythm of a heartbeat. His muscles burned with the effort of moving. Each joint, each tendon stretched and pulled as if they were being rearranged, reshaped. And the sensation, God, the sensation never left him. There were nights when Simon would wake up to find that his skin had grown tighter, as if his body had swollen overnight, his flesh stretching unnaturally over his bones. He could feel the tugging, the pulling at the edges of his skin, as though it were trying to break free, to burst outward, but at the same time, it was anchored to him, wrapped tightly in a web of something alive. And always, there was that sense of watching. He didn't know how to describe it, but when he closed his eyes at night, he could feel it. The sensation that there was something in the dark with him, something aware of him, something that was becoming more familiar to him than his own self. The first time he felt the compulsion, he didn't know what to think. It was the middle of the night when it happened. He had spent hours pacing, dragging his feet across the floor, when the tugging sensation began again. It wasn't like before, when it had been subtle, something lurking just beneath the surface of his skin. Now it was full-fledged, his body moving against his will, jerking and twitching like a puppet on strings. He had no choice but to follow the pull, as though it was dragging him toward something. Simon's eyes darted toward the door. There was an odd feeling about it, as though the door was calling to him, beckoning him, whispering, and he couldn't stop himself. His feet moved before his mind could catch up, dragging him toward the exit of his apartment, as though they were on a path he had no power to change. The apartment was eerily quiet, too quiet. It felt colder now, the air heavy and thick, but Simon could hear the slithering in his veins, the odd, unsettling pulse of life beneath his skin. It was in his chest, his limbs, his fingers. They tingled as they reached for the handle of the door, pulling it open without thought, without hesitation. There was no fear, only the compulsion to move forward. He stumbled out into the hallway of the building, his steps quickening, though his mind fought against it. He wasn't in control anymore. He had never been in control. The dim hallway lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to move with him as he walked. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating him, drawing him deeper into the maze of the apartment complex. The hallway stretched on forever, and Simon's head spun. His thoughts were a tangled mess, his pulse erratic, his breathing shallow. The feeling of being watched, of something observing him from the dark corners of the hallway, made his stomach churn. It was only then, when he stood at the door of the stairwell, that he realized he didn't even know where he was going. The stairwell beckoned him, the silence growing heavier as he stepped closer. He didn't need to go up. He didn't need to go down. His feet were already moving, heading toward the stairs, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. He descended, his footsteps hollow on the metal stairs, echoing in the emptiness. The stairwell felt endless, a dark pit with no way out. The building felt like it was alive, like it was wrapping around him, drawing him in deeper with every step he took. When he reached the basement, Simon stopped. He didn't remember deciding to go this far down, but somehow his body had brought him here. The basement was an old, forgotten place, unused and filled with shadows that swallowed up the light. The walls were damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something faintly metallic. And then he saw it, the mirror. It wasn't large, and it was covered in a thin layer of dust, but Simon knew it was important. He couldn't look away, even as his breath caught in his throat. The glimmering skin beneath his fingertips, the sensation of things moving inside him. It all seemed to come to a head as he approached the mirror. His reflection was wrong. So wrong. His face looked the same. His eyes the same. Except there was something else there, behind his own eyes. A presence. A shape. Simon stepped closer, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He reached up toward the mirror, the reflection mimicking his movements, but slower. Like it was behind him, a moment behind, struggling to catch up. And then the voice came again. "You're becoming us." It was a whisper, deep and hollow, and it seemed to come from within the mirror, from within his reflection. The voice seemed to laugh softly, a sound that made his spine stiffen, a sound that felt like it was coming from somewhere inside his chest. The sensation of movement underneath his skin intensified, and he could feel it now. Them. Whatever it was that had been crawling beneath his flesh for days. The thing was alive. It was in him, but it wasn't him. It was twisting him, warping him into something else entirely. It wasn't just his skin that was changing. It was his soul. Simon's hand trembled as he reached out to touch the glass. The moment his fingertips met the surface, the mirror rippled, warping beneath his touch. The glimmering of his skin flared, and he gasped, feeling an overwhelming sensation of pulling, of being yanked forward. In the reflection, his own hands, his hands, were no longer his own. They were gnarled, twisted, fingers stretching unnaturally long. The veins beneath the skin were thicker, darker, blacker, as though they were filled with ink, flooding out like poison. "Let go," the voice hissed. Simon felt his knees buckle beneath him, and the next moment, he was falling toward the mirror. Simon didn't hit the ground. There was no sudden crash, no painful collision with cold cement, no broken bones or sharp, jarring pain. Instead, he felt a slow, dizzying pull, as though the mirror itself were alive and swallowing him whole. His body tumbled forward, moving through the glass like water through a crack in the dam, sinking into something dark and cold and endless. His skin burned, his veins pulsed with a sharp biting heat, and yet strangely, he felt weightless, like a leaf caught in an invisible current. He gasped, a breath that didn't feel like his own, as he was sucked deeper into the blackness. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. His arms, his legs, everything was frozen, as if the moment he had crossed the threshold into whatever world lay beyond the mirror, his very body had surrendered to the will of that strange, inescapable force. He tried to scream, but there was no sound, no voice. His mouth moved, but no air came out, as if it had been stolen from him by the thick, suffocating blackness that surrounded him. His eyes darted around, desperate for something to focus on, but all he could see was nothing. It was all just a sea of pitch-black darkness that stretched on forever. No, this isn't real. His mind fought against the suffocating sensation, but the pull, that invisible force, kept him rooted in place, unwilling to let him fight his way free. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure let up. Simon collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, but the air that filled his lungs was thick and heavy, foul almost, but at least it was air. The blackness slowly started to recede, fading into a fog that was thick, suffocating, but not dark. And then, for the first time, he looked around. He wasn't in the basement anymore. He wasn't in his apartment. He was in a different place entirely. An endless, empty hallway stretched before him, lined with doors that were all slightly ajar, their insides shrouded in thick shadows that twisted and writhed, like something waiting just out of reach. The walls, once solid and firm, now seemed as though they were made of soft, oozing tissue, swollen and grotesque. The air hummed with a low vibrating sound, and as he slowly stood, his feet scraping the floor with a sound too loud for the silence, he could feel the strange pressure of something shifting under his skin again. This place, this world, was no longer familiar. It was as though Simon had slipped into some warped, nightmarish version of his apartment building, where the laws of physics didn't apply, and the rules of reality had been twisted and bent beyond recognition. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, a maze of doors and corridors that all led nowhere. He glanced down at his hands, his arms. His skin was glistening, shimmering, but it wasn't just that now. No, now it was worse. The oil, or whatever it was that was moving beneath his skin, was spreading out of control. It was no longer confined to his arms or legs. It covered his entire body, seeping out of his pores, slick and alive, crawling under his flesh, like an army of tiny, invisible insects. Simon's hands shot up to his face as the realization hit him. It was happening again. Something was inside of him. Something was growing beneath his skin. It was as though his body were a vessel, a puppet controlled by unseen hands, and he had no choice but to obey. It was never you. The voice whispered inside his mind, low and guttural, like a laugh in the dark. Simone stumbled backward, his body jerking against his will, as though he was being dragged along by some unseen force. His reflection had been a lie. There was no longer a him inside his body. There was only the thing that had taken over, the thing that was now wearing his skin as a costume, pretending to be human. "You will never be free," the voice murmured again. "You are ours, all of you." Simon felt his stomach twist, the bile rising in his throat, but no matter how hard he tried to steady his breath, he couldn't shake the feeling that his skin was slipping further and further from him. His body was no longer his own. His joints creaked and groaned as if they were falling apart, and every movement felt forced, unnatural, like he was being made to move, manipulated by some unseen hand that was growing stronger with every passing second. "Turn around." The voice was louder now, its command unwavering, filling his head until it felt like it was going to explode. Simon tried to resist, but it was like trying to fight against the tide, trying to hold himself in place while everything around him was being swept away. His body obeyed. His feet shuffled beneath him as he turned slowly, almost unwillingly, toward the door at the end of the hallway. The door, unlike the others, was closed, locked perhaps, but that didn't matter now. Simon didn't have the luxury of choice. When he reached it, his hand went to a knob, and the sensation of that thing inside him, the thing that wasn't him, rushed to the surface. It moved faster now, pushing out through his skin as though it had finally grown impatient. The slick oil spread over the door handle, making it harder for him to grasp, the force of it making his fingers twitch and jerk, unbidden. Simon flinched, horrified by what he saw in the dim light. His reflection in the door's glass was no longer just his face, his hands. No, now it was something else. His skin stretched tight across his face, the dark veins pulsing underneath, and behind his eyes, there was something else, something watching, waiting for the right moment to break free. His breath hitched. He knew that whatever this was, it wasn't just changing him. It was replacing him, hollowing him out from the inside. His hand twisted the door handle, and the door creaked open. Behind it was not the next hallway. It was an empty room, a single, dimly lit space, barren except for a small wooden chair in the center, its legs caked with dirt and age. The air felt colder in this room, and the moment Simon stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him, leaving him in total darkness. His heart hammered in his chest, and then the voice. It was louder now, as if it was inside his mind, inside his bones, inside his very thoughts. Sit down. Simon didn't have the strength to fight anymore. The body that had once been his own refused to listen to his commands. He was nothing now but a puppet, waiting for the strings to tighten and pull him deeper. He moved, his legs carrying him to the chair, sitting down in the dust and shadows, his body trembling uncontrollably. And as the darkness closed in, Simon could only feel one thing. The skin beneath his fingertips was no longer his own. The room, suffocating in its silence, seemed to hold its breath along with him. Time, or whatever warped version of it existed here, seemed to stretch on endlessly, every second lingering, like a memory that Simon couldn't quite grasp. The air was thick with a scent he couldn't name, something metallic and sweet, like rot, but not quite, and it filled his lungs with every breath he took. He tried to move, tried to break free, but his body remained frozen, rigid in the chair. He didn't even remember sitting down. His limbs simply obeyed. You are ours. The voice, no longer a whisper, now filled his mind in a maddening roar. It was every corner of his consciousness, every dark thought, every fear he had ever buried. And it was so strong, so relentless, that he couldn't tell if it was his voice anymore or something else entirely, something else that had taken over. Simon's body began to tremble, a slow, unrelenting vibration running through his muscles, as if they were straining against invisible chains. His skin, no, not his skin, pulsed with that thick, suffocating oil, now spreading down his arms, over his face, slipping through the cracks of his fingers, merging with the very air around him. It wasn't just his hands that had changed now. The skin on his face, his neck, his chest, everything had begun to deform, twisting in a grotesque imitation of his former self. The oily substance that had once been confined to his skin now moved beneath, like a serpent slithering through his veins. His eyes burned with a sharp, impossible ache, and the blackness inside his body felt alive, gurgling, swelling like a horrible growth that had taken root deep in his bones. It's growing, he thought, as the pressure inside him reached a breaking point. His teeth clenched, his mouth open wide in a silent scream. Every inch of him screamed for release, for freedom, but there was no escape. The reflection he had seen in the glass earlier, the one with the monstrous face, the dark, oily veins running across it like cracks in an ancient statue, wasn't a reflection anymore. It wasn't just something he saw outside of himself. It was him. It was all of him, filling his mind, seeping into his thoughts, controlling him. It had been inside him for so long, growing, feeding, waiting for the right moment to finally take over. It was taking over now. A slow, almost tender movement crept through his chest, as if something inside him was stretching. His ribs felt like they were being pulled apart, his lungs struggling to inhale against the pressure. The thing inside him, if it could even be called a thing, was no longer subtle. It was forceful, insistent. His muscles spasmed involuntarily, his arms jerking as the oily substance bubbled to the surface, breaking through his skin in dark patches. Simon's fingers twisted against the armrests of the chair, feeling the texture of his own skin turn slick and smooth beneath his fingertips, as though it were no longer flesh, but something foreign, something other, something that belonged to someone or something else. Then, through the fog of panic and dread, through the weight of the transformation, Simon saw it. The doorway, the one behind him, the one he had walked through not minutes ago, was open now, and through the door, beyond the empty space, beyond the twisted hallway, he saw a figure standing in the distance. A woman. The same woman he had met in the market. Simon's breath caught in his throat. She stood there, motionless, watching him with her unnervingly calm expression. The market had been a blur in his memory now, a haze of confusion that he couldn't quite piece together. But she was something he couldn't forget. She had warned him, hadn't she? The skin will take you. The words echoed in his head like a mantra, an accusation, a fate sealed in the very fibers of his being. She had known, hadn't she? Known what was coming. She had seen it, understood it in a way that Simon hadn't been able to grasp at the time. But now he did. She had known what the skin was, what it did to those who let it into their bodies, what it turned them into. It had all been leading to this, leading to him. A twisted form of laughter bubbled up from his chest. He wasn't sure if it was his own voice anymore. The sound that came from him was hollow, distant, a wet rasp that didn't belong to him. The woman in the doorway didn't move. She just stood there, staring at him with cold, unblinking eyes, as though she were waiting for something, waiting for the right moment. Simon wanted to call out to her, scream at her, but his mouth wouldn't obey. It was as though his body, his very will, had been stolen from him, replaced by something far darker, far older than anything he could comprehend. Come to me. The voice was her voice now, a calm, eerily soothing presence that seemed to wrap around him like a shroud, pulling him forward. Simon's body reacted, of course, against his will. His hands, now more like claws than anything else, gripped the armrests tighter, his legs moving with mechanical precision. Each step a struggle to hold onto what was left of himself. He rose from the chair, his knees nearly giving out from the weight of it. His body moved toward her, jerking and twitching, his movements no longer human, but something else entirely. The skin, that awful, living oil, had overtaken every part of him now. He could feel it crawling inside of him, breathing beneath his flesh, tugging at his bones, taking everything he had ever been and turning it into this. The woman didn't speak as Simon approached, but her eyes never left him. There was no pity there, no regret, just the cold, steady gaze of something that had seen the world burn and had long since accepted its fate. She reached out to him then, her hands not touching him, but brushing the air around him, as though caressing his very soul. And that was when Simon knew. It wasn't just him. It had never been just him. He was the last one, the final piece, the last person to be consumed. And as the oil, the creeping thing beneath his skin, took full control over his mind, over his body, over everything that had ever been Simon, the woman smiled. Her teeth were white, sharp, and hungry. Simon screamed, but the scream was swallowed up by the darkness. The first time it happened, Mark didn't think much of it. He had just woken up, groggy from a restless night's sleep, the sheets still tangled around his legs. The gray light of early morning filtered through the half-open blinds, spilling into the room in thin, angular beams, the kind of light that made everything seem more like a memory than the present. He rubbed his eyes, stretching his stiff muscles, and that was when he saw it, sitting on the windowsill, perched like a sentinel. A crow. It was a perfect black shape against the gray sky. Its beady eyes were locked on him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. For a moment, he just stared back, unsure of what to make of it. The bird's feathers shimmered with an oily sheen, and it was so still, so focused, that it almost seemed to be waiting. Mark couldn't say for sure how long they stared at each other. Maybe a few seconds, maybe longer. Time always felt distorted in the mornings, especially when you'd just woken up. But whatever the reason, the crow never moved. It didn't flutter or squawk. It simply sat there, watching him. Mark shook his head, clearing the fog of sleep from his mind. Probably just a bird, he muttered to himself. Nothing weird about that. He turned away, heading into the bathroom to start his day, trying to ignore the creeping sense that something was wrong. It wasn't like he hadn't seen crows before. He'd grown up in a small town, surrounded by fields and woods, and crows were as common as any other bird. Nothing unusual. Still, when he glanced back through the bathroom window, the crow was there again, staring through the glass. He froze. What the hell? It wasn't just a trick of the light, or a shadow, or his tired eyes playing tricks on him. The bird was there, just as it had been before, perched on the edge of the window, like it had been waiting for him. Mark felt a cold knot form in his stomach, but he tried to shake it off. Maybe it was the same crow. Maybe it was simply attracted to the building. Still, it felt wrong, like a warning. Just a bird, he muttered again, this time louder, trying to convince himself more than anything. But as he washed his face and splashed cold water on his neck, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air felt thicker somehow, and the house, his home, seemed quieter than usual, more suffocating. The hum of the refrigerator, the low buzz of the lights, everything seemed distant, muted. He finished his morning routine, grabbed his coat, and left the apartment, trying to shake off the sensation that the crow's eyes had followed him, even as he stepped out the door. By the time he reached the small coffee shop around the corner, the unease had started to feel like a shadow hanging over him. He chalked it up to the weirdness of the morning. Maybe the lack of sleep was finally getting to him. He pushed open the door to the cafe, the familiar warmth and smell of coffee filling the air. The barista, a young woman with messy hair and a permanent look of exhaustion, greeted him with a quick smile. "Morning, Mark," she said, already reaching for the espresso machine. "Morning, Claire," he replied, managing a smile as he settled into his usual seat by the window. He liked coming here every day. Its smallness, its quiet charm, the sense of routine it offered in a world that seemed to be falling apart at the seams. But today, as he glanced out the window, something caught his attention. Another crow. This one was sitting on a light post across the street, watching the cafe through the glass. It was the same sharp, focused stare that had unnerved him earlier that morning. The feathers glistened in the light, the bird's dark eyes glinting as if it knew something he didn't. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. It couldn't be the same crow from his apartment. He'd walked several blocks to get here, after all. But the sight of it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Nonetheless, Claire noticed his distracted expression and followed his gaze. "You okay?" she asked, eyebrow raised. Mark cleared his throat and nodded quickly. "Yeah, just bird." But he couldn't shake the feeling, the strange tension in the air, for the way the crow seemed to be watching him felt too intentional, too personal. Then something else happened. As he sat there, sipping his coffee, the feeling of being watched grew even more oppressive. He couldn't help himself. He glanced around the cafe, eyes flicking over the tables and chairs, to the people sitting there, some reading newspapers, others on their phones. But what struck him, what made his blood run cold, was that there were more crows. Each person in the cafe, whether they were sitting near the window or not, had a crow near them. Some perched on windowsills, others sat on the edges of signs or lampposts, but they were all there, all staring in through the glass. Some of the crows didn't even seem to care about the people inside the cafe. They just stood there, heads cocked at odd angles, focusing on the pedestrians outside. But some of them, like the one across the street, were staring straight at the people inside, staring straight at him. And then, before he could think about it too much, something even stranger happened. The crows started to move. One by one, they took off, lifting into the air with a sound that was all flapping wings and feathers, a cacophony of black shapes that danced through the morning light. But it wasn't random. No, these birds weren't just flying away. They were heading in one direction, toward the old church at the end of the street, a crumbling, centuries-old building that had been abandoned for years. Mark stood up abruptly, the chair scraping noisily against the floor. He was out the door before Claire could ask him if he was okay. His mind raced as he crossed the street, his eyes locked on the sky where the crows had just flown. He couldn't shake the thought that they were trying to tell him something. He arrived at the church just as the last of the crows disappeared into the towering spires of the building. He stood there, staring at the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. Something about the place had always unsettled him. Maybe it was the way the vines had crept up the stone walls, or the broken stained glass windows that let in too much light. Maybe it was the whispers in the wind, the sound of something that wasn't quite a breeze. But whatever it was, Mark knew that the crows had led him here for a reason. As he stood there, wondering what he should do next, a single crow appeared in the doorway. It was perched on the old, rusted handle of the church door, staring directly at him. Its beady eyes glinted, unblinking. Then slowly, the door creaked open. Mark didn't move for a moment. He stood there in front of the crumbling church, staring at the open door. The crow, perched on the rusted handle, didn't seem to be waiting for him to make a move. It just stared, its eyes gleaming black and wide in the dim light of the street. Mark felt an odd sense of inevitability in that gaze, as if the bird wasn't just watching him, but measuring him somehow. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves that had accumulated on the church steps. A distant rumble of thunder echoed in the sky, though it wasn't quite storming yet. Mark took a step forward, his boots scraping against the rough stone, and the crow didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head just a little more to the left, its eyes never leaving him. That was when the unease in his stomach blossomed into something else. Fear. Real, palpable fear. He wasn't sure what he expected to happen. Maybe the door would creak open further. Maybe a voice would call out from inside, or the crows would descend on him like an army. But the only thing that happened was the quiet, almost mocking presence of the crow. Watching, waiting. For a long moment, Mark debated what to do. Part of him wanted to turn away, to forget about the birds, to convince himself it was all a coincidence, a figment of his overactive imagination. But that persistent feeling gnawed at him, and the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that he was being dragged into something that he couldn't control. His body moved before his mind could catch up, stepping forward and pushing the heavy door open. The interior of the church was cloaked in shadow. The stained glass windows shattered, their colorful shards scattered across the pews like glittering confetti. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and decay. And yet, as Mark stepped over the threshold, he felt an odd magnetic pull drawing him deeper into the church. He couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason why he should feel compelled to go further, to follow the crows inside. But something inside him, the part of him that had always been drawn to darkness, to the unknown, urged him forward. As his footfalls echoed through the emptiness, a single, distant call sounded from somewhere in the church. Mark paused, glancing around. The crow, the one that had opened the door for him, had disappeared into the shadows. He wasn't alone. The air inside the church seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, as if it had been waiting for him. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, the sound filling his ears, but his feet continued to carry him forward. The crows had led him here. He had to know why. In the center of the church, beneath the rotting beams of the ceiling, stood an altar, bare and neglected, draped in faded cloths, its wood cracked and warped with age. A strange symbol had been etched into the floor in front of it, a series of jagged lines forming a shape that was almost familiar, like something he had seen in a dream. The symbol seemed to pulse with a subtle, almost imperceptible glow, as if it were alive. Mark knelt down, his breath catching in his throat. The ground beneath him felt cold, and his fingers trembled as they brushed over the worn edges of the symbol. It wasn't just a marking, it was alive. He could feel something moving beneath the surface, something ancient, something that had been buried here for a long time. The sound of wings flapping echoed through the church, and Mark whipped his head around. The crows were gathering in the rafters above, perched like black statues, watching him. There were more of them now, dozens, their eyes gleaming down at him like a dark sea of judgment. And that's when he saw it. At the far end of the altar, a shadow flickered. It was no more than a ripple in the air, a distortion that couldn't quite be explained. It was almost as if the light itself had bent, as though the darkness within the church had taken on a physical form. Mark stood up, his hands clammy with sweat. He couldn't explain it, but he knew, deep in his gut, that he wasn't alone anymore. There was something else here, something waiting for him. The shadow shifted again, and this time, Mark could see it more clearly. The figure, draped in dark robes, stepped into the faint light. Its face was hidden beneath the hood, but Mark could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. The crows above were silent now, watching with that same unblinking gaze. Everything was still, too still. Mark's breath caught in his throat, his heart thudding louder in his chest. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, the figure spoke. "You've been marked," it said, its voice like 1,000 rasping whispers, coming from all directions. "The crows have chosen you." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. The words, simple and chilling, sent a tremor through his body. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, as if the words themselves had paralyzed him. The figure stepped closer, the sound of its robes rustling like dry leaves. Mark could feel the temperature drop in the room, the air thickening with the weight of something ancient and malignant. The figure raised a hand, and for the first time, Mark saw the symbol etched into its palm. It was the same as the one on the floor of the church, but this one seemed alive. The lines moved, swirling as though they were made of something other than ink. "You will understand soon enough," the figure continued, its voice growing louder, clearer. "The crows are not here to simply follow you. They are here to mark you, to carry you to what is inevitable." Mark's throat went dry. What do you mean?" The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it reached out, its skeletal fingers brushing over Mark's chest. The cold of its touch seeped through his clothes, sending a shock of ice through his veins. For a brief, terrifying second, he felt something shift beneath his skin. Something alive, something ancient, crawling beneath the surface. "You will follow the crows," the figure whispered, its voice barely audible. "And when the time comes, you will lead them." The darkness around Mark seemed to close in. The crows above him began to stir, their wings beating in unison, a deep, rhythmic sound that pulsed in time with his racing heartbeat. And in that moment, Mark understood. He understood why the crows had been following him. He understood why they had appeared at his window, why they had gathered outside the cafe, why they had led him here. He was chosen, and he had no choice but to follow them. Mark could feel the weight of the figure's touch lingering on his chest, cold as death, as if something ancient and unseen had anchored itself to his very soul. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he wanted to scream, to run out of the church, to escape whatever was happening to him. But the words the figure had spoken echoed in his mind, relentless and unyielding. "You've been marked." The crows above him shifted again, their eyes still locked on him with that same unnerving intensity. Their wings rustled in the stale air, a constant rhythmic sound that seemed to reverberate in the very bones of the church. Mark couldn't shake the sensation that the birds weren't just watching him. They were waiting for him, waiting for something to happen, waiting for him to understand. And then the figure spoke again, its voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You will not escape this, child. The crows have chosen you, and the mark will not fade." Mark's pulse quickened. He stumbled backward, his feet tangling in the debris that had gathered on the church floor. He looked frantically around, searching for an exit, a way out. But the air seemed thick with dread, as if the very walls of the church were closing in on him, pushing him toward the altar, toward the symbol on the floor. "You can't run from your fate," the figure continued, its voice like the wind, whispering from every corner of the church. "The crows are not just messengers. They are guides, and you will follow them, whether you want to or not." Mark's head swam. His thoughts felt clouded, like a fog had descended on his mind. The last thing he remembered clearly was the eerie stillness of the crow's eyes as it opened the door for him. Now, the meaning behind it all was starting to make sense in the most terrifying way possible. They weren't just following him. They had been marking him, setting him on a path he could not turn from. Mark's voice cracked, dry and hoarse from the fear that gripped him. What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it lifted its hand, and Mark felt something shift in the air. It was subtle at first, but then it became impossible to ignore. The mark on the church floor, the same symbol that had made his skin crawl, began to glow. A faint, sickly light pulsed from within, like a heartbeat, quickening and fading with each passing second. The ground beneath Mark's feet seemed to tremble. He could feel the vibrations in his bones, a low hum that crawled up his spine and made his stomach twist with nausea. The crows above him began to stir once more, their calls echoing throughout the church, reverberating against the walls. And then, as if in response to the sound, the shadowed figure raised its hood, revealing what Mark had feared most, its face. There was nothing human about it. The skin was dark, almost charred, the features sunken and stretched in grotesque ways, as if the face had once belonged to someone who had been dead for far too long. The eyes, those hollow, empty sockets, glowed with a faint, unsettling light, and Mark could feel their gaze on him, burrowing into him like a parasite. The figure's lips twisted into a grin, a horrible, inhuman grin that stretched far too wide for anything alive. "You will become one of them," the figure whispered, and Mark could hear the hunger in its voice. "You will follow the crows, or you will be consumed." A wave of dizziness struck Mark, and he swayed on his feet. His vision blurred for a moment, then sharpened as the figure took a step forward, its robes sweeping across the floor. Mark stumbled backward, his legs weak beneath him, but the pull toward the altar, toward the glowing symbol, was undeniable. The birds above him, a swirling mass of black feathers, cawed louder now, their voices rising in unison, a chorus of unnatural sound that seemed to vibrate within his chest. They were gathering in the rafters, their eyes fixed on him, watching him with predatory focus. Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. His legs felt like they were made of stone, but the pull of the church, the pull of the figure, was too strong. His body moved of its own accord, like a puppet on a string, and he was walking toward the altar before he even realized it. "Stop," he gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "Please stop." But the words fell on deaf ears. His feet carried him forward, dragging him closer to the symbol, to the place where the figure had first appeared. His hands were shaking, his skin clammy with cold sweat. He wanted to run, but something inside him, something dark and terrible, was urging him to keep going. When he reached the altar, he stopped, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The crows above were silent now, their eyes glowing as they watched him. The air in the church had grown colder, almost unbearable, and Mark's teeth chattered as he looked down at the symbol on the floor. It was pulsing now, its lines shifting and moving as if they were alive. They wriggled beneath the surface of the stone, forming strange patterns that Mark couldn't comprehend. A ripple of panic washed over him, but he couldn't move. His legs were rooted to the spot. The fear inside him bubbled up, and he wanted to scream, but his mouth wouldn't cooperate. The figure's voice came again, soft but unmistakable. "You are the chosen one," it whispered, its voice both soothing and terrifying at once. "You will lead them, and the crows will obey you." Mark's mind spun. The words didn't make sense. He didn't understand how he could be chosen for something like this, how he could be tied to these birds, to this place. His heart hammered in his chest as the world around him seemed to tilt and warp, the shadows in the corners of the church stretching longer and deeper. Suddenly, Mark felt a sharp, burning pain in the center of his chest. It was as if something had punctured his skin, a heat that radiated outward, spreading through his veins like wildfire. He gasped, staggering backward, clutching at his chest, but there was nothing there. No wound, just the searing sensation of being torn open from the inside out. The figure chuckled softly. "It has begun." Mark fell to his knees, the pain overwhelming him, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, he understood. The crows weren't just following him. They were his burden, his destiny, and it was one he couldn't escape. The pain in his chest flared again, this time more intense, and he gasped for air, his body trembling. His hands shook as he reached toward the floor, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. The symbol beneath him seemed to pulse faster now, as if it were alive, calling to him. And then the crows above him screeched. The world seemed to shatter around him. Mark's body trembled uncontrollably. His hands clutched at the rough, cold stone of the altar beneath him, the stone that seemed to pulse with that sickly glow. His chest still burned, that unrelenting, deep ache inside him, as if his heart were being ripped out from the inside. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, the air thick and cold with a stench he couldn't place. It was not just mildew and decay, but something far worse, a bitter, metallic scent, like blood on the wind. The crows above him were silent, as if they too were waiting, watching. Their eyes, black as pitch, glimmered in the dim light that bled in through the shattered windows. Mark felt the weight of their gaze, a presence so heavy it was as though the birds themselves were pressing down on him, pinning him in place. And then the figure, the thing, moved again. It stepped closer, the soft swish of its tattered robes, the only sound in the otherwise oppressive silence. Mark could feel the air grow colder as the figure neared, its face obscured once again by that deep, impenetrable hood. But even without seeing its face, he could feel it. Its eyes, those glowing pits, drilling into him, studying him, searching for something. Maybe for signs of fear, maybe for signs of resistance. It didn't matter. The figure reached out, its bony, elongated fingers brushing against Mark's forehead, and the contact sent a shock through him, cold and searing. It felt as though the very marrow of his bones had turned to ice. He jerked back, gasping, but he couldn't break free from the pull. There was no escape. "The time is almost upon you," the figure's voice hissed. "The crows are only the beginning. Their mark is upon you now. You will be bound to them. to the fate that awaits. Mark's vision blurred, spinning. His heart raced, pounding in his chest like the frantic beat of a drum. He could feel his pulse throbbing in his neck, his temples, his fingertips. The pain in his chest was unbearable, and yet it was only growing worse, sinking deeper into his bones, deeper into his very soul. The figure's voice cut through the fog in his mind again, low and insistent. This is your destiny, boy. You can no longer run from it. You will lead them, all of them. The crows stirred again, their wings rustling in a sound that reverberated through the church. The sudden movement made Mark freeze, his muscles locking up, his skin crawling. They were close now, too close. The birds had begun to circle overhead, their dark forms flitting against the shadows. Each beat of their wings made the floor shake, a rhythmic pulse that echoed in time with the thudding of his heart. No, Mark gasped, the words slipping from his lips before he could stop it. He felt the desperation rise in his throat, the desire to resist, to scream, to run. This isn't me. I won't lead them. I can't. But the figure only chuckled, a sound that sent a jolt of cold fear racing through him. You've already begun, boy, it whispered, its voice soft like velvet, yet carrying the weight of eternity. You don't get to choose. You will lead them, and in time, you will understand. The figure raised its hand, and suddenly, Mark was no longer aware of the cold, the pain, the crows above him. It was as though something else had taken control, something darker, something that had been waiting inside him all this time. His body moved of its own accord, as if the very ground beneath him had summoned him to rise. Mark stood, his legs shaky but firm. His body swayed with a terrible, unnatural grace. The figure took a step back, and for the first time, Mark could see it clearly, see the unnatural light that seemed to flicker from its eyes. The ancient mark burned into its palm. The symbol on the floor, the one that had pulsed beneath him, was now seared into his memory. He felt it, alive, in every inch of his body. Mark's mind screamed at him to stop, to fight, to run, but his body betrayed him. His limbs jerked forward, the movement not his own, but somehow guided by the dark force that gripped him. He took one slow step after another, moving toward the altar again, toward the pulsing symbol on the floor. His breath quickened, chest heaving with terror, but he couldn't stop. The crows were in motion now, flapping their wings in unison, the beating sound deafening, as if they were chanting in some ancient, forgotten language. Mark's legs carried him closer and closer, the darkness around him closing in. You will understand soon, the figure repeated, its voice seeping into his very being like poison. The crows are not here by chance. They are part of the plan. Your plan, Mark's vision, swam with dark spots. His heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. The altar loomed ahead, the symbol beckoning him with its pulsing light. He could almost hear it now, whispering to him, drawing him closer. You will lead them, just as I did. The figure's voice was almost tender, coaxing. The crows will follow. They always do. And then it hit him. A flash of memory, sudden and sharp, cut through the fog in his mind. A dream he had years ago. So long ago, it felt like a different life. A dream of a crow, of crows, flying through an endless sky, black wings beating against the wind. And in that dream, he had been standing at the center, arms raised, commanding them. He had been them, they had been him. Mark gasped, his stomach lurching as the realization settled in, cold and suffocating. It had been in his blood all along, waiting for this moment to unfold. This was his fate. There was no escaping it. The birds, the symbol, the shadowy figure. It was all part of the same design. His eyes locked with the glowing eyes of the crow that had been perched at the church door when he first arrived. It had been waiting for him, just as the others had been waiting, following him, marking him. Mark felt a cold hand grip his heart, and he shuddered as he realized what he had become. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was part of something darker, something far older. The crows were calling to him now. He could hear it clearly. This time, not in the air, but in his mind. Their voices, low and insistent, whispered his name over and over. Leader, leader, leader. He was theirs, and they were his. Mark's hand shook as he stared at the symbol, still pulsing beneath his feet. The ground felt slick beneath his shoes, slick with something cold, something alive, as if the earth itself were breathing beneath him. His chest tightened, the pain still there, a constant gnawing ache in his heart that refused to let him go. But now there was something else, something worse, the pressure in his mind, the weight of the crows. Their call had settled into his skull, the words they whispered not just in his ears anymore, but in his very thoughts. Leader, leader, leader. The chant was constant, unrelenting. It echoed in his head, louder and louder, until it felt like it would split him open. He felt the heat in his chest grow, the symbol on the floor pulling him forward, dragging him toward it with an invisible force. Leader. The figure's voice whispered from behind him, its words like a velvet poison that crept into his veins. You've begun your journey. They are waiting for you. The crows. Mark turned, but his legs didn't obey him. He was no longer in control of his own body. His arms, his hands, his very muscles. They were responding to something else, something dark, something older. His heart thudded in his chest, a slow, rhythmic beat that matched the crow's wings. He could feel them above him now, those black shapes circling, circling, their eyes never leaving him. No, he gasped, his voice cracking. Please, not this. I can't be the one they want. But the words fell hollow in the air. He didn't even know if he believed them anymore. He had seen the crows. He had seen their eyes. He had felt their hunger. They had been with him all this time, pulling him toward this moment, toward the center of it all. The figure, its hollow eyes watching him, had been right. He had been marked long before he ever stepped foot in this cursed church. He had been chosen. The crows began to caw again, louder now, their voices blending with the dark whispers of the figure behind him. Their wings beat harder, faster, a storm of sound. Mark's stomach churned as the figure stepped closer, its bony hand extending to touch his shoulder, cold as death itself. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through his spine, and suddenly, everything was clear. The birds above him weren't just cawing. They were calling to him, not as a leader, not as an equal, but as their master. He was the one they had been waiting for. He had been chosen to lead them into the darkness. The figure's mouth moved, but the words no longer made sense. They were nothing but gibberish, a language Mark couldn't understand, couldn't place. It didn't matter. It was all meaningless now. The only thing that mattered was the crows, their eyes, their call. They were his now, and there was no escape, no redemption, nothing left but this path, this purpose, this curse. Mark tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat. The air grew thick, heavy, and suddenly he wasn't sure if it was the crows surrounding him, or if it was the weight of the fate that had settled over him. The figure's voice rose again, a distorted chant that vibrated through his very bones. "Take them to the sky," it said, its voice low, reverberating, "and let them be free." For a moment, Mark's thoughts were consumed by the words. Take them to the sky. Let them be free. He wanted to ask what it meant, but the words were no longer his. They were the crow's words. He could feel their hunger in his veins, their impatience growing as the wind picked up in the church, shaking the glass of the broken windows. A sharp pain stabbed through Mark's chest, as though a dozen needles had pierced his skin. He staggered, but the pain didn't stop. It only intensified, as if something was inside him, burrowing deeper, twisting around his organs. It spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of his body, as if the crows themselves were taking root in his flesh. He screamed. No, he didn't scream. He cawed. He heard the sound come from his own mouth, the sharp, unsettling cry of the birds, and his heart stopped. The air around him turned black, the shadows stretching until they became something solid, something living. The crows filled the air, filling his lungs, his veins. He could hear them now, a chorus of voices, a cacophony of hunger and anticipation. "You are one of us now," the figure said, its voice distant and cruel, as the shadows enveloped Mark, wrapping him in a blanket of dark wings. "You are the leader now." Mark's skin began to prickle, and his eyes widened as something shifted within him, something that wasn't human. His bones cracked as they stretched, reshaped, like the body of a crow, longer, leaner, sharper. His hands, they were no longer hands. They were talons, black and jagged, and the sensation of claws scrabbling against the stone sent a pulse of panic through him. But the panic didn't last. His own skin, his own body, no longer felt like his own. It felt as though it belonged to something far older, something much darker. Mark opened his mouth, but the sound that escaped him was not a voice. It was a scream, yes, but it was the scream of a bird, a shriek that sliced through the air, the final confirmation that he was no longer himself. The crows responded immediately, their cries rising in unison with his. They descended from the rafters, swarming around him, blotting out the light, their black wings flapping in a frenzy, their beady eyes now as wide as the abyss itself. And just as the pain reached its peak, as if some dark force had taken hold of his soul, Mark felt himself shift. No longer a man, but not yet fully a crow. He was suspended between the worlds, caught in the throes of his own transformation. He felt his mind slipping away, his thoughts melding with the bird's endless hunger. The vision that flooded him now was a blur of sharp, jagged landscapes, a never-ending sky filled with darkness, a sky where he was the master, a sky where he could command the crows to do his bidding. And as the crows took flight around him, circling him, Mark, the man, the leader, let out a cry that echoed through the church, through the cold night, through the very bones of the earth. It was no longer his voice. It was the voice of the crows. They had found their leader,